All right, Select Committee will come to order. Welcome to the second day of the Blockchain Select Committee here in Laramie, Wyoming. We have another good agenda today. I think we had, Mr. Co-Chairman, some pretty good discussion yesterday. We learned a lot about agentic AI and have something then to consider there. Today, we're looking at some banking issues, some privacy, name, image, likeness issues, and some updates on Speedies. But this morning, before we get started, on the agenda, we wanted to follow up with some missed opportunities for public comment yesterday. And so we'll get to those early. I think we'll have a couple of quick presentations and updates from some cryptocurrency miners in the state of Wyoming. But with that, before we get to that, let's call roll.
Good morning. Good morning, Mr. Chairman. This is roll call for the Select Committee on Blockchain for September 17th. Senator Ellis.
Excused.
Senator Murphy.
Here.
Senator Nethercraft. Here. Representative Andrew.
Here.
Representative Singh.
Here.
Representative Yen.
Here.
Mr. Kaufman.
Here.
Mr. Pope.
See you out there.
I don't see him online, Mr.
All right,
Chairman.
excuse for now. I'm sure he'll join.
Mr. Revel.
Here.
Co-Chairman Western.
Here.
Chairman Rockfus.
Here.
You have a quorum.
Excellent. Okay, then in a moment we'll be getting to state banking, but I wanted to bring up Mr. Lee Filer, who didn't have a chance to join us yesterday. If you want to come up, Lee, and give us a little bit of an update on your activities. And you know the drill, Lee. Introduce yourself to the committee. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. And first, I want to apologize for yesterday. My calendar, for some odd reason on my phone, thought Wednesday was the day, but I went through my emails last night and I was like, oh no, this is bad. So I reached out to a couple of you to, see if I could at least come in and give you guys kind of a yearly update on what we're doing at CryptoNight. By the way, my name's Lee Filer. I'm a co-founder and site director of CryptoNight Hosting in Laramie County. But the first things I want to bring up is our economic impacts of this year for our company with crypto mining. This past year, we paid $1.1 million in sales tax revenue to the state of Wyoming. We had another about $25 million between power purchases, payroll, and other investments that our company has done in this past year. If we want to look at as far as the network worldwide with Bitcoin mining, we're right now about 680 exahash is what's online right now. My company is 1.7 exahash of that 680 running. Another thing that we talked about last year that I need to bring into this year was our expansion of our company. Of course, it takes a while to get power contracts done, leases done, electrical one lines, permitting and all that. But we are now 10 days away from breaking ground on our new 37 megawatt site west of Cheyenne. And I want to bring those economic impacts to the committee also just from that, just before we're even up and running. The immediate economic impact to our community and the state would be, it would be about, I had this written down, about $9 million more immediately is what it is. When that includes materials, contractors, labor, all those types of things. And we're also going to be doubling our staff for our payroll because we're pretty much doubling our size. Because right now we'll be at about 77 megawatts running after this site's up. That'll also bring in a revenue generator to the state of about 700,000 more a year in tax revenue. Once we have our expansion and we're up and running. A few other things that we have is we've been doing a lot of research, and you guys will all receive an email from my nephew and my business partner, Joey. He couldn't make it. He's actually with his daughter right now. He has to be a chaperone for something at school. But he is going to send you guys an email, and it's going to show the state of Wyoming is actually less than 1%. It's probably actually less than 0.5% of all the hash rate of Bitcoin mining. The state has done a great job passing blockchain laws and trying to be more crypto friendly and to bring in a new industry to Wyoming. But when we're less than 0.5% of the whole, Bitcoin mining operations in the world, it's kind of rough. Right now, New York, believe it or not, is 9%, and we're at 0.44%. Texas is beating us. North Dakota is beating us. Montana is beating us. Georgia's beating us. The state of Washington is even beating us right now. And I think a lot of that has to do with Bitcoin mining has really steered toward the price of power and being able and available power. So when you take them both into consideration, as we know, Wyoming is pretty well handled by the co-ops. We do have some public power companies and stuff like that in Wyoming, but pretty much if you look at the whole eastern side of Wyoming, it's co-ops. Co-ops do not participate in a lot of those different open markets. Their transmission companies don't allow it or whatever it might be, but that is what's hurting us right now. And in the state of Wyoming, pretty much 95% of all Bitcoin mining in Wyoming will be done in Cheyenne and Laramie County because of that. So I think that's something maybe the committee needs to look at, and or working with the co-ops, which my company has worked heavily with a lot of the co-ops, and we're trying to get them more on board. Get that power rate where they can open it, buy it on the open market, allow us companies to buy blocks of power, all these different things. But the co-ops, their hands are pretty well tied when they have two different boards you got to work with. You got to work with the provider plus the transmission company. So, but I think if we can find a way to bridge those gaps, I think you'll see Bitcoin mining in Wyoming just boom. But until then, I think our hands are tied, and what available power is going to be used up pretty much in Laramie County. With that, I'll stand for any questions.
Thank you, Lee. Appreciate that. Committee questions.
Good, Chairman.
Any questions? I see Representative Singh first. We'll get to you, Mr. Co-Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Filer, when you say that states like Washington and Texas and New York are surpassing us, are you specifically referring to Bitcoin generation?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Singh, what I'm saying is a full hash rate, what they're actually mining in their state. So if we look, like 9% of all the hash rate of Bitcoin mining right now is done in New York. I can't give you the exact specifics. You guys will get all that in an email from Joey. But that's what it is they have a lot bigger operations because their power rates and their power companies and co-ops are actually working with those companies.
Follow-up, Representative? Okay. Anyone else? Mr. Co-Chairman?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Filer, maybe walk you through in a little bit more detail your relationship with some of these utilities, negotiations for power, these agreements, the tone and tenor. Could you just give us a little bit of background on that?
Mr. Filer, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Weston, yes, that's where our relationship is. Actually, any crypto miner, I would say any large power contract, it's a heavy negotiations with those co-ops and or power companies. The hiccup that we have a lot of times is the power company is more than willing to, in a co-op, is more than willing to give you all the power you want. It's where they purchase their power from, which is through the transmission company. And I don't want to bring up any names and throw anybody out there, but when they, of course, they have their hand in the pot, then the power company has their hand in the pot and works their way down. It makes the negotiation a lot harder. When you work with like a public company or a publicly traded company, they're very capitalist. Of course, they want to sell you power, but you're working with one group. You make a power contract with them on a curtailable load, it's more streamlined, it's faster. But the other ones, when you have a transmission company giving them their power, and the power company can't sell that power unless they sell it for a certain rate, and then they have to go back and negotiate. There's always a fight there, if that makes sense. And then, of course, those power contracts also have to go through FERC. Once any of those power tracks go through FERC, it takes a lot longer of a process also, because now we're at the whim of a federal government bureaucracy that tells us when and if they could sell us the power at a certain rate and all those other things. So it's a heavy negotiating process, and it takes a lot longer to work with the co-ops. And most of the time they can never, between the two, come up with a good price for a curtailable load. and it dies. That's where the conversation dies because it becomes very unprofitable to do this when it comes to that.
Follow up, Mr. Co-Chairman? Committee? Mr. Feiler, you mentioned some states that are succeeding. New York, I think there's a lot of particular reasons why New York is succeeding, but some of the other states, you wouldn't necessarily expect them to be in a position ahead of Wyoming. What do you see as the key position or key differences there on why other states have been more successful in sourcing the power and getting good prices?
Mr. Chairman, I believe that one of the reasons why is because one, I think a lot of them don't, they're governed by their public service commission or whatever that might be, and they don't have to go through FERC, but it also, a lot of those other co-ops are just willing to negotiate and their transmission companies are willing to negotiate. If we look at, say, let's just say North Dakota, let's just throw that out there. North Dakota has an abundance of power that they never use. So most of the time their state believes that if we can keep that power in our state, then we can of course get sales tax revenue or whatever it might be from that purchase of power instead of going across state lines and then eventually never being used and gets dumped in the ground. But those states are really pushing those co-ops to work with large load factors like Bitcoin mining, AI, and those types of companies in order to keep that power in their state. Wyoming, when I'm not saying it's bad to go through FERC, but when it's all regulated through FERC, and then you have two entities in every co-op that you have to negotiate with, it makes it just so hard, where those other states, they streamline it. And my nephew and business partner, Joey, is going to get some more information for you guys on that. He's researching the heck out of it because our company has been looking at other places now. We're going to be pretty much maxed out where we're at in Laramie County. So now we're starting to look at other places like North Dakota, Montana. I hate to say it, even Washington State. And if we look at the statistics of it right now, and just to kind of give you a rundown, Washington State has 1.9% of the hash rate. They have way more taxes than we do, corporate taxes, income taxes. Their tax rates are much higher, but their hash rate is way higher. People are still going there because of that power rate. And I was wrong about Montana. We're actually bigger than Montana. Sorry about that. But North Dakota, South Dakota, Texas is at 28.5%. As we know, they're not regulated one bit by FERC. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of regulations that just tie a lot of people's hands from the power industry all the way down.
On that, Mr. Feiler, do you see, one of the concerns that we've talked a lot about, obviously, is, too much regulation versus too little regulation. You look at Texas, and they've had substantial problems for residential citizens of the state because through their deregulation, they ended up having, brownouts during severe storms and things along those lines. At the same time, it seems to me like Wyoming's system is the most regulated it can be. And so not just for residential protection, but I think we regulate top to bottom in a very monopolistic way. Do you see any other state in your early dealings that might have maybe a more nuanced approach where for large purchase, maybe you have less regulation, a deregulated structure, but from a residential ratepayer standpoint, you've got a good system that provides that protection?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I think, when we bring up Texas, their regulation, yes, there's hardly any regulation when it comes to their power. That's one thing that's good about Wyoming with a little bit of regulation is our curtailable loads. We do curtail. We are willing to shut down. We're going to make sure nobody's going to go without heat in the winter or if there's if it's really hot in the summertime, and the air conditioners need to go running and they need that power. We shut down our load in order to provide that to the community. A lot of those places like Texas, the only time they really curtail if it's not profitable to mine. That's it. So they self-curtail is what they do. That would be good for Wyoming if we could self-curtail also. But those regulations in place do help us. But if we look at like North Dakota, they are doing, they're knocking on the door of being the best. of
Okay.
deregulating it for large power loads, because what happens is the mining industry becomes pretty much a digital power load for the power companies. Because if those power companies ship that power out and it doesn't get used here, and it goes down transmission line, never gets used, and it gets dumped. So say we have a nice cool summer or a nice warm winter, a lot of people and residents aren't using that power. So it gets dumped into the ground. So what we do is we take that power, we're going to run it, and we're going to run it with our Bitcoin mining machines, right? And then what happens is if something happens where they need to curtail us back, we shut down, they could still provide that power in case of, things like that happen in Texas. So that's one thing that's a little bit different than Texas and us, is the fact that they get to self-curtail, we don't.
Mhm.
So I think that's a good thing that Wyoming does have, but it also keeps that power in Wyoming, because only about 17% of the power we use, somewhere roughly around there, or 17% of the power that we generate is used in Wyoming. The rest of it goes over across state lines, which in turn, when it doesn't get used, gets dumped in the ground. The power companies, of course, are at a loss. So where's that come back to? The consumer. So what happens with data centers and crypto mining and AI, if we consume that power, that way the power companies aren't losing that revenue, that could actually help the prices
Yeah.
for our residents and our homes and other businesses.
Absolutely. It provides tremendous resilience. There's no question about it.
Yeah.
Further questions?
Mr.
Mr.
Co-Chairman.
Co-Chairman, go ahead.
Oh.
Sorry, I see Senator Furphy. Go ahead. Start with you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So if I'm hearing it correctly, it's not a matter of we have the capacity to take care of all of your needs. It's just a matter of mostly price compared to other states. Do I understand that correctly?
Lee, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Furphy, you're absolutely correct. It's because of how Bitcoin mining is in our industry. Every so many years they have a halvening. And what happens during the halvening is there's less Bitcoin released every 10 minutes. So right now we just had a halvening earlier this year. So now there's only 3 Bitcoin released every 10 minutes instead of 6. So what that does is it, makes it a lot harder in order to get rewarded with the Bitcoin by solving the algorithms with the machines. But also the difficulty rate shot up too, because as the price of Bitcoin goes up, the difficulty rate goes up because more people are putting more machines online. Okay. So that's where it becomes more of the issue of power and how much it costs. Because when you're only getting half, because our revenue went from, here to here overnight during the halvening. So when we look at that, the cost of power is very key. Yes.
Thank you. Follow up, Senator? Okay. Mr. Co-Chairman?
Mr. Co-Chairman, more than anything, just an observation. I feel like the Corporations Committee would be an excellent landing spot for Mr. Filer. Let's talk about utilities. No, more than anything, Mr. Filer, I really appreciate your time to come and testify. Obviously, you've been part of this conversation for a long time now. And I was certainly pretty discouraged after 2020 conversations, but I've been cautiously optimistic about folks like you and how you've stuck around and continue to plug into our grids. And despite those headwinds, continue to mine. So I really, really appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Fowler. And I think one thing we talk about this, that it's not just Bitcoin mining. AI is going to be in a similar situation. And there are a lot of other industries that are electricity intensive industries that Wyoming is unable to attract and land in the state of Wyoming because we have power location uncertainty and because we have pricing uncertainty due to our current regulatory structure. So this is a perfect case study. And I also appreciate the discussion about how when we have interruptible use cases, it really does improve the resilience of the grid, allows honestly more development of things like renewables where you have less certainty in the availability of power relative to base load. So it very much helps to have, local Bitcoin and AI data intensive applications in the state. So we appreciate that work and we appreciate those points. Thank you, Mr. Fowler. And
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
always good to see you and
Oh,
look
yeah.
forward to your next update.
Okay.
Yeah, when you've got those other 22 megawatts of power online.
37.
37, excellent.
As a matter of fact, in 10 days. So
Beautiful.
10 days, we're going to be breaking ground. So we got everything turned in, all the
That's great to
I's
hear.
and T's crossed and stuff like that.
That's great to
So,
hear. And you mentioned $1.1 million in sales and use tax.
Yep.
Do you know offhand your property tax payments?
Our property tax payments, it kind of varied because of, I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Our property tax was kind of all over the place at first because we're such a new site at that one area. So they have to first do all their assessments, evaluations. So, but I'm pretty certain I'd have to get with my accountant, but we were still in, $35,000 range on part of our property a year to, anywhere from there to about 75,000 with our other stuff too.
Gotcha.
So it's Laramie County should love us.
I think they
Pretty
probably do. Yeah.
And we're just a tiny piece of that.
Excellent.
Yep.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yep. And West Mining, you guys want to come up and join us? And we have one more company that we haven't had an opportunity to meet through the committee before, but they're joining us today. So please introduce yourselves and give us a little bit of background on your operations, as well as some of the challenges that you're experiencing that we might want to be aware of.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, committee. My name is Jamie Terranova. I represent 44 West Mining as well as the Wyoming Blockchain Alliance. We are running a mining site up in Gillette, currently running about 5 megawatts of mining, all immersion. We have available to us on our site another 15 megawatts and are contemplating ways to grow out to that 20 megawatt full capacity. We are largely self-funded to this point. We have engaged in several conversations over the last, many conversations over the last few months with investors, partners of different shapes and sizes as to how to partner on the site and what we want to talk about today are the challenges with respect to the energy rate structures within the co-ops in Wyoming, specifically Northeast Wyoming, where we are. We've had a good partnership with Powder River as our partner up there, and they've been in getting us up and running, and up to this point they've been great with the shifting winds of the mining world and other high performance computing type applications. The rate structures that are in place are more or less pre-crypto blockchain rates. So I think it's time that we need to re-examine that and perhaps come up with some way to really embrace the industry. And mining may be just the tip of the iceberg here when we talk about AI and other HPC type applications. So we think it's imperative for economic growth, job creation, and just the future of being a leader in the space and going forward. So that's what we've been focusing on primarily at 44 West, and looking forward to hearing any questions.
Great. Thanks, Jamie. And please introduce yourself.
Jason Gunderson with 44 West, founding partner with Jamie and his team. Saying only to echo what Jamie said and Mr. Filer said, the open access to the market, being able to lower that rate would be imperative for us to continue operations and continue to invest to grow to 20 megawatts. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Absolutely. Excellent. Committee, any questions for 44 West? Mr. Co-Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. Yeah, I know we chatted about this a little bit, but just for the edification of everyone in the room, maybe kind of walk us through some of the obstacles you guys are facing and scaling up and getting to where you want to be strategically as a company.
Jamie, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Representative Western. So Powder River is a co-op within Basin Electric's larger system. And the challenge there is that Basin has jurisdiction over 9 states and different load characteristics in different parts of their system, and they have to develop programs and rates that are all inclusive of their system. So we feel like the characteristics in the northeast part of the state are unique in that there is excess power infrastructure, and considering a load like a crypto or blockchain load coming in with interruptibility and the ability to balance the grid, and run at 95 plus uptime and high power factor, we feel it's a perfect match. So while it's a challenge to have any change come through Basin, what we've been sort of representing is that this district, I believe it's District 10, I could be wrong about that. Our district has unique characteristics that are worthy of some sort of special cutout or consideration. And again, it's imperative to the competitiveness of the industry in the state. You know, we know what's going on in Texas and other states, as Lee mentioned, and for a state that has done so much work in the space and has openly embraced the industry, I feel like we need the support underneath from the utilities to really support that agenda.
Great thought, Mr. Co-Chairman.
Mr. Co-Chairman, thank you. And not to get too deep in the weeds with you guys, but you know, the multi-state protocol that most of Wyoming is in, Rocky Mountain Power, all that kind of stuff, is obviously more oriented towards states to the west and Oregon and those states, which we could have a whole different conversation about that multi-state protocol. But for the ones that you guys are subject to, do any of those kind of agreements within that area that Basin operates in, does that really inhibit your ability to negotiate these contracts to the best of your advantage for your outfit?
Mr. Chairman and
Go ahead,
Representative Westman.
Henderson. Yep.
Yes and no. So some of the other states that are open and have actual special rate tariffs, is what they're called, within these utilities within Basin, are open. One of the reasons North Dakota is ahead of us is because they have actual special rate tariffs given by Basin to participate in the open market and be paid to do so. So some of the times when they're curtailing, they're actually being paid to curtail, so they can help the grid and make sure that it's stable. So right now, we haven't been able to get Powder River and Basin to allow a special rate tariff for Bitcoin mining or AI or something of that nature, although we are curtailable, although that we can shut down. So the reliability nature of Bitcoin mining is great for the utility at any given point in time to be able to call us and work with us and have a special rate tariff. So that's the difference in some of these states that you're seeing. We work with companies in Iowa that are regulated, fully regulated, Georgia, North Dakota, and we're on the energy side of the business, and they have actual special rate tariffs. And that's what we've requested of Basin for Powder River. And as Jamie alluded to, that's an uphill climb, and we're continuing to work that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Great follow-up.
Mr. Co-Chairman, it's almost like we should talk about a special rate tariff for a deregulated zone.
Yeah, wouldn't that be a good idea? Something along those lines.
Yeah. Have we had that conversation?
I feel like
Mr. Co-Chairman?
little deja vu there. Yeah.
No, maybe my last question is, in terms of the actual infrastructure, grid infrastructure that you guys are interfacing with, I mean, is it adequate? Is it workable for you guys and for your operations?
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Representative Weston. Yes, the infrastructure we've had no issues there. The power's there, it's available, it's consistent. So no issues there. And I recognize that there are other sites in which that's the case that are being hamstrung by the things we're talking about here. So yeah, no issue with the quality, abundance, consistency of the power.
Good to hear. Any follow-up? Committee, anyone else have anything? Go ahead, Representative Bien.
Mr. Chairman, thanks for joining us. When talking to the co-ops, is there a single thread where they all have a reason for not wanting to do a special tariff for curtailable power, or are they all over the board, or is it generally just, it's something new and I don't want to try it sort of deal?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Yen. Yes. So most of the background that we're receiving is the lack of infrastructure internally to provide the data from either Basin to Powder River or Powder River to the end user. So most of that is lack of infrastructure, predictive analysis tools, things like that can actually allow access to those products. That's where we get a lot of the pushback today. The thing that, you run into with Basin is they have predictive analysis tool. They're massive. Powder River is a little smaller. They've been working for the last year on their tools. As we've been working with them with those tools, we still don't have a, end date of where we might have access to a market that could have a special rate tariff. But that's the pushback as of we've seen today. We've developed our own internal predictive analysis tools to try to predict peaks and predict these things to reduce our rate. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Follow up? Good, okay. Welcome, Mr. Pope.
Morning.
Good morning. No worries, understood. All right, please. Go ahead, Jamie.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do want to add that so Black Hills Energy has a rate in place that has worked and does work currently, and I know a few of the larger miners are on that rate, which they developed specifically for high performance computing applications. So that's an interruptible rate with a lower energy and demand rate in exchange for interruptibility when the system signals. And I think that is a good template for what can be accomplished statewide. It's workable. So what we're doing, trying to avoid coincident peaks, and the more we grow, the harder that is to do. That's obviously not a recipe for growth expansion. So I think the interruptible rate, taking that as a template and working off of that is a pretty good approach here. Thank you,
Great.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Mr.
Go ahead,
Chairman,
Jason.
one more item, in that interruptible rate there doesn't allow deregulation. It's still a regulated rate that would be approved by the utilities that we would be allowed to participate in at their call. So just want to add that
Right.
too. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And one thing, committee, recall that our co-ops are far less regulated. I won't say entirely unregulated, but far less regulated by the PSC and far less subject to the tariffs that the PSC works with our regulated utilities to develop. So while we did some work that I think made a difference and led to Black Hills putting together a very good tariff for interruptible power, that does not necessarily carry over to the co-ops in the state based on our regulated utility structure and how they're largely but not completely exempt from those. Any final questions? Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Coach. Chairman, honestly, more just a statement. We really appreciate you guys investing, your money in the state of Wyoming. This has been a long journey, and I applaud anybody who's willing to allocate resources and manpower to invest in Wyoming. This committee really appreciates that.
Absolutely. Jason.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the time.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you,
Thank you.
Representative Russ.
Appreciate both of you being here. Thank you. All right. With that, let's get back to our originally scheduled agenda and bring up state banking. We've got the Defense of State Banking Act, which we've looked at before, but I believe there were a few tweaks to it for the draft that we have before us today. So let's start off with, if I can find the bill. David, if you want to walk us through, I think there were a couple of changes. Hopefully everybody remembers the original discussion, but take us through the changes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. David Hopkinson with the Legislative Service Office, taking a look at 25 LSO 90 Working Draft 0.7, and just focusing then on the differences between this version and the previous one that the committee saw at its last meeting. First, that section 1 is new language to the bill, and that is just a non-codified, and it provides that kind of a statement that when federal financial regulators overreach or abuse their authority in the regulation of Wyoming state chartered banks, that the harm is also to Wyoming itself, and that Wyoming has developed innovative and rigorous banking laws to encourage financial institutions to locate within the state and increase and that has increased revenue to the state. Federal overreach decreases revenue to the Wyoming Division of Banking, decreases state revenue, and drives out financial institutions. Aside from that, there is new language on page 3, subsection B. And really the core of the bill is this subsection B. This is the one that really provides for enforcement. And that's the new language that we see there is on line 20 by a Wyoming state chartered bank. So it provides the Attorney General shall investigate any allegation by a Wyoming state chartered bank of unlawful disparate treatment. And so the previous bill hadn't really specified who could bring the allegation. So this narrows it down. The Wyoming state chartered bank brings that allegation, and it needs to be unlawful disparate treatment by federal or other state regulators. And then it does require, as we saw previously, the Attorney General to take any available action to defend Wyoming's interest in that dual banking system and ensure that state charter banks are treated fairly by other regulatory authorities. And with that, I'd stand for any questions.
Thank you, David. Any questions? All right, pretty straightforward. That's what we discussed last time, making a couple of tweaks. Go ahead, Mr. Co-Chairman.
Or just kind of just a thought on page 3, Mr. Co-Chairman, line 21. Where it says, disparate treatment by federal or other state regulators, is it? My thought is maybe we strike the, I know this is getting a little ahead of ourselves, but the thought would be striking state and just state regulators in general. Keeping it encompassing of all regulatory entities, but that's just kind of a thought that I had, Mr. Co-Chairman.
So, Mr. Co-Chairman, the concept of bank of lawful disparate treatment by regulators, was that your concept as opposed to federal or other state?
Yeah, just say, yeah, the Attorney General shall investigate any allegation by a Wyoming State Chartered Bank of unlawful disparate treatment by federal or by regulatory entities. That could be state or federal. Just kind of a thought.
Okay. Do you see that? How do you see that as being different from what we have?
Mr. Hopkinson, do you think there's any material difference there?
Mr. Hopkinson?
Mr. Chairman, I think the only difference there would be potentially the limiting language that it be federal or other state regulators and not really accounting for the Division of Banking. Whereas if we change that language, it may apply also to the Division of Banking, which certainly that's a policy choice, but that would be a little odd. I'm not sure.
Okay. All right. Any other points of discussion before we go to public comment? All right. Seeing none, actually, we've got Division of Banking to start with. Thank you so much. Okay. Jeremiah, do you want to come up though and answer, see if there's any questions or? You can officially tell us you have nothing, which is just fine.
Jeremiah Bishop, Banking Commissioner. Yeah, I don't have any prepared remarks. I think this is something that we were fairly similar to what was discussed last time. As to the question of the potential change, I think the only thing that I could think of, again, I'm not the attorney in the room, but changing that may affect foreign regulators. I don't know if that's the intent of this at all, but some of the entities that this could fall under are subject to foreign regulatory agencies.
It's interesting.
I don't know if that the proposed language by Chairman Western would maybe help include that, because I think as it states right now, I'd say federal or state is only domestic.
Right. Great. Thank you. Any questions for Jeremiah? Go ahead, Mr. Coppin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner Bishop, I just have a general question, and that is, I mean, the language of this proposed statute says the Attorney General shall investigate and then shall take action. And I'm just wondering, does that remove or inhibit your ability to, build relationships with these states and work with them? You've done a tremendous amount of work kind of bridging the gap with some states right on the SBDI. So I don't want to inadvertently take away your ability to maintain those relationships by forcing the Attorney General on its own to take action.
Commissioner Bishop, thoughts?
Yes, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Kaufman. I would say that I think you're right. The word shall means if anybody makes a complaint, that AG shall investigate it. It doesn't say they shall take anything further than that. They'll just investigate it and then take any appropriate action. If they were to actually take an action, yes, I think that would absolutely inhibit or have an effect on the Division of Banking's relationship with whatever that regulator is. We've done this before already with an ongoing lawsuit, and we were able to navigate that, but that's not always going to be the case. I think I had spoken at prior meetings that is one of the risks of this, is that we do have to work with these other agencies. Historically, that's been fine, because we've been able to take the stance that the Division of Banking is not the AG, the Attorney General's office. We don't direct the Attorney that office, and we are completely separate from whatever action they may or may not be taking. But yes, I think that is a potential setback of having this language.
Thank you. And Commissioner Bishop, the page 3, line 22 actually does have a second shall, as Mr. Coppin was pointing out, the Attorney General shall take any available action to defend Wyoming's interest in the dual banking system and its interest in assuring. So it shall investigate and shall take action. It sounds like you may have some concern with that shall take action, but at the same time, it also sounds like that you isolate yourself, you create a wall. Is that accurate? Go ahead.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I'd agree with that. Again, what's the point of them just investigating it unless they're going to take an action? I understand why that's there.
Gotcha.
And it makes sense to me.
Okay.
I guess one other thing that with this new language that I was also going to bring up was right now this is geared towards banks only. We also regulate non-banks pretty heavily, trust companies, money transmitters, especially. And they also have federal regulators such as the CFPB. That's the thought. I don't know if this is, I think right now that the intent of this is just for banks only, but just realize the CFPB regulates a lot of non-bank entities. And also we have a lot of trust companies in this space solely regulated by us, but that could change in the future.
Thank you, Commissioner. Any follow-up, Mr. Kaufman? Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Maybe just one, I guess, Commissioner, I would ask you, I mean, would it be helpful to expand this to particularly money transmission? Obviously, that's been a big bone of contention with some of the SBDIs and definitions of banks in other states. So would opening this up to money transmission or trust companies for that matter, do you think help?
Commissioner.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Kaufman, I can say right now, we've never had any instances of non-banks having these issues because under our law, the SPDRs are banks and the issue that they're not considered banks in other states and that this can't really do anything against that. Potentially, I think the AG will absolutely be looking at other states' money transmitter laws to see if they're, having disparate treatment against our banks as money transmitters. But I think that's a legal statute in another state that this won't address. I think that's more of a policy decision if you all want to include a broader range of entities.
Mr. Kaufman, any follow-up? Okay. Senator Furphy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, let me ask a big, broad question. Do we even need this bill? I mean, the dual banking system is not at risk. I know banks across the country, we can discuss that further, are adamant that we continue a dual banking system. And what's in here, since we have a strong state bank commissioner, if any of these issues come up that a bank feels they're being treated unfairly, they can directly approach you and you can make a decision, should it be referred to the Attorney General or not. So I would like input, Mr. Chairman, whether we even need this bill. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Senator. Commissioner, did you want to weigh in on that?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Furphy, I'll weigh in a little bit on that. So as it currently is, yes, if there is, I think something, if there's a treatment of one of our institutions by another state or federal regulator, the Division of Banking could refer something to the Attorney General's office. That's generally not what we do. We don't like intervening on behalf of an individual company that we regulate. I think that violates conflicts of interest that we have to keep separate from. So I think what this does is it does direct the Attorney General's office into what to do. Now, whether or not they can already do that or not, I can't speak on their behalf. I don't know. But yeah, to the, I don't think we have taken a stance and urged our Attorney General to take action on behalf of a company or a charter as a whole that comes from a different executive branch office other than myself for a reason. So I think that be a better question for the Attorney General's office of, does this give them any more or less power than what they already have? I'm not sure of that.
Thank you, Commissioner. Any follow-up, Senator? And Senator, on that point, recall the discussion that led to this comes down to the treatment of our speedy banks in the dual banking system and the unwillingness of some states to recognize them as banks, but primarily the unwillingness of certain federal banking institutions to recognize them and provide access to master account permits. What we've seen in the past is that while those companies would then have some standing and the capacity to engage on their own behalf, the state of Wyoming was actually in a bit of an awkward position and was challenged to find a direct path to intervene on behalf of the entire Speedy Bank institution, as opposed to individual Speedy Banks, which are bringing suit. So the intent of this particular act is to say, no, it's not just the institutions themselves that individually should be weighing in. It's the state of Wyoming on behalf of our dual banking system where we're being treated adversely because of the reasons that are laid out. So there does appear to be a gap in what our state can or feels that it can do without legislation like this that takes the next step and says, yes, the state of Wyoming has direct interest in protecting our position in the dual banking system on behalf of all of our banks, not just wanging through an amicus brief on an individual case. So trying to take it to the next level. That's the justification for why we were discussing this. I hope that makes sense. Go ahead, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Then I question, shouldn't we define Speedy Banks in this? When you read through it, it sounds like normal banks. And I would think we should identify that as a separate entity in this regulation.
Yeah, and Senator, when we talked about drafting it, that was discussed, but the idea was, well, really any challenge of any of our state chartered banks where we were being treated unfairly should be something that the state should step in for and stand up for, and that it shouldn't be a unique treatment of Speedy Banks. It should be a defense of all state banks. We could do that, but that would then narrow the potential protections, which we don't foresee at this point in time, of other state chartered banks. And that was why it was structured this way. We could certainly do that, but it seems like that would be taking away prospective potential protections of our other state chartered banks in ways that we don't foresee at this point in time. That was the thought. Commissioner, anything else to add?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. No, I don't have anything else to add.
Great, thank you. Appreciate it. All right, any more public testimony in the room on this? Any more public testimony in the room? Seeing none, let's go online. I see Mr. Meyer. Let's bring Mr. Meyer. Go ahead, Mr. Meyer.
Morning, members of the committee. Scott Meyer on behalf of the Wyoming Bankers Association. I think a lot of the other questions have kind of been, that I've had in my mind, have been answered already. I do agree that the language in the bill is pretty broadly written. I guess there are a lot of situations where national associations such as the American Bankers Association or the Independent Community Bankers of America have joined in various lawsuits with various associations and banks in challenging regulations, whether it's through the CFPB or the FDIC or what have you. The way that this is written, I would think that this could be a big asset, although I would think it'd be very expensive. But I certainly guess that your traditional community banks have been wanting to push back a little bit on the FDIC and the CFPB and some of these others. So perhaps this might help. I'm not sure you can legislate standing to do any of that stuff just because you claim it's a challenge on the dual banking system, but those are our thoughts.
Thank you, Mr. Meyer. Any questions for Mr. Meyer? So, Mr. Meyer, my understanding is that the broader language rather than narrowing it down to Speedy, but including all state chartered banks, you find to be the appropriate approach because it provides that potential for protection for all the state chartered banks. Is
Mr.
that
Chairman,
accurate?
I think the way it's written, I would agree with that will allow, assuming that the state has that authority and has standing, that we would welcome somebody else taking the lead on some of that stuff and putting part of the bill.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Meyer. Questions for Mr. Meyer? All right, seeing none. Thank you, Mr. Meyer. Do we have any further public testimony online? All right, seeing none, one more time, anyone in the room? Seeing none, public testimony is closed. Back to the committee. Mr. Co-Chairman, any thoughts before we go to a motion? I think this is in good shape.
I think it is in good shape. The only kind of dovetailing on what Mr. Kaufman said, I think, look, we absolutely want to defend our banks, our two-tier banking system. We got to defend that tooth and nail. The second, it might be worthwhile having a discussion around adding some flexibility around the second shall. I think leaving the first shall in there, shall investigate. I think that absolutely needs to be left in there. Maybe further discussion around the second shall and giving a little bit more discretion to the Attorney General, depending on the nature of that investigation and what the office concludes. And that's kind of the only thought I have at this specific moment, Mr. Co-Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. Committee, anyone have any thoughts, anything to add? Mr. Kaufman, go ahead.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, thank you. I echo the comments. That was one of the reasons I asked the question. I'm not sure that's a great look to put the AG, in the position of having to take some action, even if it's potentially not something that the commissioner, thinks is strategically a good idea for the state. So that makes me, I think it potentially creates a pain point between AG and the commissioner, right, on what that action is. Again, I'm in agreement with the intent of the bill, but that makes me nervous.
Yeah. And, one possibility there, on line 22, the Attorney General shall take it says any available action. It could be any appropriate action. That sure changes the intent. And there might be a better way to phrase that. I don't think we want to entirely take it off going from shall to may. But perhaps as a way to thread the needle. Go ahead, Mr. Co-Chairman.
Maybe just throw another option out there for the committee's deliberation. The Attorney General shall take any available action it deems necessary.
Yeah, that's also good. I like it.
So we'll defer to our in-house counsel.
Yeah, counsel.
Give us the
one of our many counsels.
blockchain rate.
I certainly like that better, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, excellent. All right. Mr. Revel, you had your hand up and then you vanished. So I'm assuming that the question that you had was answered, but my apologies for not calling on you earlier. Did you have anything that you wanted to raise?
Nothing further, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Okay. Any other comments before we work the bill discussion? All right, seeing none, is there a motion on the bill? All right, we've got a motion by Representative Singh. Is there a second?
Second.
And a second by Representative Yen. All right, any amendments or discussion on page 1? Page 2? Page 3?
Mr. Co-Chairman,
Mr. Co-Chairman.
again, this is a conceptual amendment. I'm certainly open to alternative suggestions, but the idea would be on page 3, line 22. The Attorney General shall take any available action it deems necessary. Adding it deems necessary, those 3 words right there between action and 2 at the end of line 22.
Okay.
David, are you tracking me on that one? Okay.
We've got a motion to amend. Is there a second?
Second.
Got a motion and a second. Any discussion on the motion? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Amendment has passed. Back on the bill. Any further amendments on page 3? Seeing none. Any amendments or discussion on page 4?
Mr. Chairman, just
go
a
ahead.
technical thing. I'm in reading that full sentence there, I think will need to be some conforming amendments. Particularly on page 4, line 1, it would have changed what that pronoun's referring to when we add that other language. So anyway, I made
Assuming we're providing discretion to fix the grammar, everyone comfortable with that? I assume so. Grammar's important. Let's do it right. All right. One question, we have an effective date of July 1st. That seems fine, but there might be, based on the timeline of some litigation, a need to expedite that. I guess we could probably look at that during session and decide whether we need to expedite it based on anything. So anybody care about that? Seeing none. All right, with that, any further discussion? Seeing none, roll call.
Mr. Chairman, this is a roll call vote for 25 LSO 90, Defense of State Banking as amended. Senator Ellis? Senator Furphy?
Aye.
Senator Nethercott? Representative Andrew?
Aye.
Representative Singh?
Aye.
Representative Yin?
Aye.
Co-Chairman Western?
Aye.
Chairman Rothfuss?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, we have 6 ayes, 1 no, 1 excused.
All right. Thanks, everyone. And that actually got us back on schedule. Good work, everyone. Up next, we've got the review of Select Committee on Blockchain and enabling legislation. Let's bring that bill up. All right. With that, Mr. Hopkinson, let's walk through some of the change in the bill. Recall, this is legislation that we've been working to amend the name of the Blockchain Select Committee, and then to some small degree, amend the responsibilities of it. So if you want to quickly walk us through those changes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. David Hopkinson, the Legislative Service Office, looking at 25 LSO 71 working draft 0.5. And really just highlighting the differences between this version and the version the committee looked at. We did change it from emerging technology to emerging technologies throughout. And then really the only addition is a new subsection D, and I would highlight that as something on page 2, line 19, where it says subject to subsection D, that C, that should be subsection D, so that's a correction we'll make. But that is new language in D, which is on page 4. And the intent of this subsection is really to provide guidance on how to handle those Title 13 bills based on the discussion the committee had last time. And that provides that any legislation that relates to Title 13 of the Wyoming statutes shall not be introduced by the Select Committee without the consent of the chairman of the Joint Minerals Business and Economic Development Interim Committee. If consent for the introduction by the Select Committee is not obtained, the legislation may be recommended to the Joint Minerals Business and Economic Development Committee for consideration. So essentially there, if the chairman of the Minerals Committee consent, then the Blockchain Committee can recommend it or can sponsor the bill. If they don't, then the bill could be sent just straight to Minerals for the full committee's consideration for sponsorship by Minerals. And with that, the rest of the changes, Mr. Chairman, are just kind of conforming and changing the name of the committee. And I'd stand for any questions on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Hopkinson. Appreciate it. Committee, any questions for Mr. Hopkinson about the changes here? Any questions? Seeing none. All right. Is there any public comment on 25 LSO 71 working draft 0.5? Any public comment, any online? Seeing none, public comments closed. All right, back to the committee for some discussion. And I know my co-chairman stepped out. Hopefully he'll be back in a second. Thoughts on the legislation? I have some, and honestly, the more we've contemplated this and based on some uncertainties and probable change in the committee makeup as we move forward, you know, I'm inclined to put this off for another year, honestly, and do this work, just revive the bill about a year from now. so that we have an opportunity to be working with a committee that will be identical to the committee that's going into the legislature, so that we can all be on the same page and advocate for it. I've been on committees before where you've had a substantial reconfiguration of a committee. You go into the legislative session, and then the advocates for the bill aren't necessarily aligned or even there any longer to participate. We're going to have some turnover, and it seems like a decision like this of changing the direction of the committee should be comprised of and advocated for by members of the committee itself. So those are my thoughts, which means I think the bill's actually in great shape. But I would pass it a year from now instead of this year, and I'd open up for any thoughts or concerns with that approach. If anyone wants to object to that path, if not, we'll probably just leave it on the table and move on with life. I see no objection from Senator Nethercott. Anyone want to weigh in? All right, seeing none. Then without objection, 12 LSO 71 working draft 0.5 is indefinitely postponed. And that's the way we get into a break with plenty of extra time for the break. And so with that, anything else we need before we go to break? Any comments, committee? All right. So we're scheduled then for 10:15 to bring up. Yep, that's our next. Our personal data and name, image, likeness legislation. So we'll resume at 10:15. See you all then. All right, welcome back from the break. Let's resume this blockchain select committee. Our next item on the agenda, Mr. Co-Chairman, is personal data and name, image, and likeness. You'll recall, had a couple of bill drafts at our last meeting that we were working on and some concepts that we tried to bring together. So this bill draft, let's see if I can find the bill draft in front of me. This bill draft brings together.
We have a lot of bill drafts.
We do. We've got a few. This bill draft brings together our discussion on data privacy and ownership of data, and starts us down a road that I think comes together nicely in this bill draft. It addresses statutes similar to California with regard to name, image, likeness, where they've had a long history of providing protections, as well as the state of New York, where they had some robust statute, and then incorporates a lot of the Colorado Privacy Act while trying to trim it down and modify it so that it's compliant with Wyoming, while further incorporating digital identity, our prior work. And also, rather than being consumer oriented, it is natural person oriented. So it's going to fundamental rights of individuals as opposed to only in your capacity as a consumer. This is the first time we've seen this bill put together in this way, although we've seen a lot of parts of it. So I think it's going to be important for us to kind of take a detailed walkthrough of this legislation. And with that, David, if you want to take us down, not just at the 30,000 foot level, but into discussion of the points themselves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. David Hopkinson with the Legislative Service Office, walking through 25 LSO 89, working draft 0.5. Mr. Chairman, you were absolutely correct there. And as far as some of the language that you'll see in this bill is modeled on California's name, image, likeness laws and modeled on Colorado's, but there are substantial differences. And I will address those as we come to them. The first thing to note, I guess one of the biggest differences is as was mentioned, Colorado's privacy laws and many other states' data privacy laws are limited in a sense that they focus on the consumer. And much of the time, they only really apply to larger social media type companies. A lot of times there's a 25,000 customer type limit on there. This bill draft does not have those kinds of limits. It would apply to anyone that processes personal data, whether it's a large corporation or even just an individual, with some certain exceptions that we will get to through the bill. It is broad, and there is that staff comment there on that page 2 does note that. A lot of the other states have very specific exceptions. This bill took a broader approach, simply saying if there's other law that conflicts or preempts, then that other law would control to the extent of that conflict. And so given that, it's very difficult to really determine just how broadly this could apply or how narrowly, given the wide variety of other laws that may be applicable. But to start with, this creates in Title 40 new articles 4030-201 through 4030-206. The first one in 201 is just some legislative findings, and that declares that a natural person's name, image, likeness, digital identity, and other personal data are inherent to the natural person and are the intangible personal property of the natural person and are subject to the protections provided by this article and the United States and Wyoming constitutions. There is a staff comment at the top of page 3 that provides an even broader approach than that first one, makes it, rather than a legislative finding, it puts it a clear statement within that statute in an alternative 201, and provides clearly that this would be intangible personal property subject to the protections provided by the article, includes the Wyoming Uniform Commercial Code, and the United States and Wyoming constitutions.
David, I'm going to interrupt you right there. So committee, this is an important difference here. And, you know, I want everyone to really be thoughtful as we go through this legislation because it is very different from what other states are doing. And I think it needs a lot of minds focused on trying to get this right and avoid unintended consequence. So with the two versions of 201 that you see on page 2 and page 3, the one at the bottom of page 2 makes it findings, and it's not really rigorous under statute, but it tries to declare that name, image, likeness, and other personal data are inherent, but it doesn't really take that next step and make it shall be, so to speak. The alternative language on page 3 really calls out owning your own data as intangible personal property under the Uniform Commercial Code, which is a big step, and it was so big, in fact, that it seemed like it probably wasn't appropriate for the first round of passing this bill. But it kind of is the intent, right? To get to the point where we have appropriate data protections and ownership and recognize it. So that's why it's called out in the two different ways. I think it's a good discussion point to figure out if we want more than just the legislative findings at this point, but it at least forecasts the intent of the direction of moving towards a 403201, where you could imagine that your personal data, which would include your name, image, likeness, digital identity, and everything else, are intangible personal property under the Uniform Commercial Code. It's just that no other state has done anything close to that, and the implications of that really take some working through and thinking through. So I wanted to pause there and highlight that discussion. David, please continue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Moving on then to the bottom of page 3, the definition section in 202. The first one up is consent, and that requires for consent that there be a clear affirmative act, signifying that the natural person's freely given specific, informed, and unambiguous agreement, and provides examples of written statements, whether through electronic means or personal digital identity, by which the natural person signifies agreement to the processing of the personal data. And then it lists some exceptions of what are not consent. In subdivision A there, acceptance of general or broad terms of use would not be consent. Hovering over, muting, pausing, or closing a given piece of content, or agreement obtained through dark patterns. And then it provides a definition in that same subsection of what a dark pattern is. That it's that interface designed or manipulated with the effect of subverting or impairing user autonomy, decision-making, or choice. Controller at the bottom of page 4 is a very key definition. A lot of what this bill applies to, it depends on a clear understanding of that particular term. And that means a person, and person here, per Wyoming statute, really is broad. It applies to organizations, individuals, kind of across the board. So it's a person, which could include a business, alone or jointly with others, processes personal data for any purpose other than personal use. And then later on, it mentions that personal use shall not include any use of a professional or commercial nature, whether for profit or not. And so the effort here is really to limit the potential impact of the bill to those who are using or processing personal data for use outside of their own personal use. On page 5, de-identified data, another important definition, just data that cannot be reasonably used to infer information about or otherwise be linked to an identifiable natural person or personal digital identity. If the controller who possesses the data takes reasonable measures to ensure that the data cannot be associated with a natural person or personal digital identity, and publicly commits to maintain and use the data only in a de-identified fashion and not attempt to re-identify the data. So in those circumstances, that would constitute then de-identified data, and the act really doesn't apply to de-identified data. So that's an important distinction. Personal data, again, a very key definition. is information that is linked or reasonably linkable to an identified or identifiable natural person or personal digital identity, does not include de-identified data or publicly available information. And then that publicly available information is information lawfully made available from federal, state, or local government records, and information that a controller has a reasonable basis to believe that the natural person has lawfully made available to the general public. So
And
again,
David, on those so far, and I think even the next one, I think those definitions are key definitions, and they're very similar to the Colorado Privacy Act with modifications to comport with a lot of our Wyoming statute, but it's language that is to a large degree already on the books in Colorado. Continue.
that's correct. And next on page 6, paragraph 5, another very important definition here, process or processing. And that means the collection, use, sale, storage, transfer, disclosure, analysis, deletion, or modification of personal data. So again, we go back to the controller is someone who processes personal data. That means that they're doing any of this list of things with personal data. Paragraph 6 provides for a definition for sale or sold, meaning the exchange of personal data for monetary or other valuable consideration by a controller to a third party, and has a list of exclusions there, including the disclosure of personal data to a third party for purposes of providing a product or service requested by the natural person, the disclosure or transfer of personal data to an affiliate of the controller, the disclosure or transfer to a third party as an asset that is part of a proposed or merger, bankruptcy, etc., or the disclosure of personal data that a natural person directs the controller to disclose or intentionally discloses by using the controller to interact with a third party, or intentionally made available by a natural person to the general public via a channel of mass media. There's a definition there for targeted advertising, which is the displaying to a natural person an advertisement selected based on personal data obtained or inferred over time from their activities across non-affiliate websites, applications, or online services. It does not include advertising to a natural person in response to a request for information or feedback. Advertisements based on activities within a controller's own websites or online applications. Advertisements based on the context of a natural person's current search query, visit to a website or online application, or the processing of personal data solely for measuring or reporting advertising performance, reach, or frequency. And so that's just all the definitions that we'll see throughout the bill. Section 203 is where we really get into the obligations of controllers and the rights that an individual has. And A, subsection A is again very key, kind of a linchpin for the bill. And that provides, again, on page 8, subsection A, line 15, no controller shall process the personal data of a natural person in violation of the natural person's personal data rights set forth in subsection B of this section. And subsection B then gets into the rights that a natural person has with respect to their personal data. Paragraph 1, they have the right to opt out. Over on page 9, a natural person has the right to opt out of the processing of personal data for the purposes of targeted advertising, the sale of personal data, or profiling. A controller that processes personal data for purposes of targeted advertising or the sale of personal data has to provide a clear and conspicuous method to exercise the right to opt out. On page 10, there's just a staff comment that noting that the language as it currently exists does not provide a method for a natural person to become notified that a controller has their personal data, and that may be something the committee may wish to consider or whether something would be appropriate to put in place there. Page 10, there's this line 12. The next right then is the right of access, that a natural person has the right to confirm whether a controller is processing personal data concerning that natural person and to access the natural person's personal data. You have the right to correction. A natural person has the right to correct inaccuracies in their personal data, taking into account the nature of the personal data and the purposes of the processing of the personal data. There's the right to deletion. A natural person has the right to delete personal data concerning the natural person. The right to data portability provides that when exercising the right to access personal data pursuant to paragraph 2 of this subsection, a natural person has the right to obtain the personal data in a portable, readily usable format, and they may exercise that right not more than 2 times per calendar year for any one controller. And nothing in that right would require a controller to disclose any trade secrets. We're on page 11, subsection C. In responding to a natural, and this gets into then the obligations that the controller has in responding to these rights, and provides that in responding to a natural person's requests pursuant to their rights under subsection B, a controller shall inform a natural person of any action taken on a request without undue delay and not more than 45 days after receipt of the request. They may extend the 45-day period to an additional 45 days where reasonably necessary, taking into account the complexity and number of requests. And the controller shall inform the natural person of an extension within 45 days after receipt of the request, together with the reasons for the extension. On page 12, paragraph 2, if a controller does not take action on the request, the controller shall inform the natural person without undue delay and not more than 45 days after receipt of the request of the reasons for not taking action. A controller shall respond to the request and provide any required information in the controller's possession free of charge. A controller is not required to comply with the request to exercise any of the rights under subsection B if they are unable to authenticate using reasonable efforts that the natural person is the one making the request. And they may request additional information to authenticate that request. Subsection D at the bottom of page 12 provides that a natural person can authorize another person to act on their behalf to exercise any of these rights, and that the controllers needs to be able to authenticate with reasonable effort the identity of the natural person and their authorized agent to take action. The enforcement of all this takes place really in subsection E here on page 13, providing that a violation of this section shall be considered a consumer transaction that constitutes a deceptive trade practice under 40.12.105. And that staff comment notes that what this does then is it basically utilizes the Wyoming Consumer Protection Act as the enforcement mechanism. And so there's a staff comment that includes kind of the relevant sections of the Consumer Protection Act, so that you can see how that might apply in these circumstances. But generally speaking, it provides opportunity for the Attorney General to enforce. Provides an opportunity for someone to complain to a controller, give them the opportunity to cure, and if they don't cure, then it gives that person the opportunity to sue, potentially with even in a class action. But those are some of the remedies that are available using this method. And then jumping ahead then to page 21. So 203, that really kind of deals more with the data privacy side of things. 204 is a separate section, getting more into the name, image, likeness side. And it does have some different mechanisms that we didn't see here in 203. And it provides in subsection A that any person who knowingly uses a natural person's name, voice, signature, image, or likeness in any matter in products, merchandise, or goods, or for purposes of advertising or selling, without the person's prior consent, or the consent of their parents in the case of a minor, shall be liable for any damages sustained by the natural person injured. 22 on page 22, paragraph 1 provides that any action brought under this section, the person who violated it shall be liable in an amount equal equal to the greater of $750 or the actual damages approximately caused by the unauthorized use. And any profits from the unauthorized use that are attributable to their use are not taken into account in computing the actual damages. And it provides that punitive damages may also be awarded to the injured party. And then in the next few paragraphs, we just got some limitations here that in establishing profits, the injured party shall be required to present proof only of the gross revenue attributable to the unauthorized use, and the person who violated this subsection shall be required to prove deductible expenses. Paragraph 3 provides that the prevailing party would be entitled to attorney's fees and costs. Subsection B on page 23 provides a definition for image that it means any photograph or photographic reproduction, still or moving, or any recording or live transmission of a natural person, such that the natural person is readily identifiable. And they would be deemed readily identifiable when it can be reasonably determined that the person with the naked eye, that the person in the image is the same person complaining of the image's unauthorized use. If an image includes more than one person or identifiable person, then the natural person complaining of the use shall be entitled to recovery only if they are depicted as an individual rather than as a member of a definable group. And you are a member of a definable group if you're represented in the image solely as a result of being present at the time the image was taken and are not singled out as an individual in any manner. Subsection C on page 24. Where an image or likeness of an employee of a person using the image or likeness appearing in an advertisement prepared on behalf of by the advertisement or other publication prepared by or on behalf of the person is only incidental and not essential to the purpose of the publication in which it appears, then that brings in a rebuttable presumption affecting the burden of producing evidence that the failure to obtain the consent of the employee was not a knowing use of the employee's image or likeness. That just basically provides some limitations on employees' use of images of your employee, of an employer's use of images of their employee. Subsection D provides that for the purposes of this section, the use of a name, voice, signature, image, or likeness in connection with news, public affairs, sports broadcasts, or account, or any political campaign shall not constitute a use for which consent is required. So those are just some exceptions. Subsection E, the use of a name, voice, signature, image, or likeness in a commercial medium shall not constitute a use for which consent is required solely because the material containing the use is commercially sponsored or contains paid advertising. It would be a question of fact whether or not the use of the natural person's name, voice, signature, image, or likeness was so directly connected with that commercial sponsorship or with the paid advertising as to constitute a use for which consent is required. And subsection F provides that nothing in this section shall apply to owners or employees of any medium used for advertising, including but not limited to newspapers, magazines, radio and television networks and stations, et cetera, by whom any advertisement or solicitation in violation of this section is published, unless it is established that the owners or employees had actual or had knowledge of the unauthorized use. So that's just an exception again for the people actually doing the advertising if they didn't know that that use was unauthorized. Then we move on to the bottom of page 25 to applicability. And here are some exceptions on and kind of limitations on how this would play out. It provides, well, the first one, subsection A, is again, as I mentioned earlier, provides that the extent that a provision of this article conflicts with or is preempted by another provision of state or federal law, the other provision controls, but only to the extent that of the conflict or preemption. Page 26, subsection B provides it's subject to subsection D, that this article does not apply to personal data maintained by a state institution of higher education, the state, or a county, city, or municipality if the data is collected, maintained, disclosed, communicated, and used as authorized by state and federal law for non-commercial purposes. So there is some limits there by generally state government and government entities that they can do or maintain personal data for non-commercial purposes. Subsection C provides that the obligations imposed on controllers shall not restrict a controller's ability to comply with federal, state, or local laws, rules, or regulations. They shall not apply where compliance by the controller would violate an evidentiary privilege under Wyoming law or prevent the controller from providing personal data concerning a natural person to a person covered by an evidentiary privilege under Wyoming law as part of a privileged communication. Subsection D provides that personal data that is processed processed by a controller under an exception provided by this section or due to a conflict with or preemption by other law shall be processed solely to the extent that the processing is necessary, reasonable, and proportionate to the specific purpose or purposes listed in this section or is otherwise authorized by this article. So that's really just trying to limit that if you do have an exception to process personal data, you have to keep it within the narrows or within the scope of that exception. And then the controller bears the burden of demonstrating that the processing qualifies for the exception or preemption, and any ambiguity should be resolved in favor of the natural person. Section 403206 provides that nothing in this article shall be construed to limit any existing rights of a natural person with respect to their personal data. And provides that the remedies provided for in this article are cumulative and shall be in addition to any others provided by law. Section 2 then provides just some conforming amendments going into the Consumer Protection Act, adding on page 28 a new subsection B there for a definition of consumer transaction, that it's for the purposes of 4012-105, the processing of personal data as applied in this newly created statute 403203. And then it goes in to 4012-105 and adds a new paragraph that provides that a person engages in a deceptive trade practice unlawful under this act when in the course of his business and in connection with a consumer transaction, he knowingly violates a provision of 403203, which was, again, that data privacy section that was newly created by this act. Section 3 then requires the Attorney General to promulgate any rules necessary to implement the act, and the act would be effective July 1st, 2025. With that, I would stand for any questions on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Hopkinson. Committee, any questions on how the bill works at this time? Mr. Co-Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Co-Chairman, I think, the idea of putting it under the Uniform Commercial Code, a really interesting idea. And my question to LSO is, am I correct in understanding that this would be the first of its kind to try to settle these types of disputes under the Uniform Commercial Code?
David?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My understanding is yes, I am unaware of any law that tries to make or associate your personal data as intangible personal property protected by the Uniform Commercial Code. So this would be the first of its kind, to my knowledge.
Mr. Co-Chairman?
Mr. Co-Chairman, I like wild ideas. Look, as with anything, the devil's in the details. There's a lot to think through, but I think at a bare minimum, this is the kind of stuff that we're supposed to do in this committee, right? We're the crazy idea committee, and I think, I know one of our attorneys is not here, but I know the other one is. And Mr. Kaufman, be curious for you to opine and on this particular idea.
Mr. Kaufman, what are your thoughts?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So on the bill in its entirety or the Uniform Commercial Code idea?
Mr. Co-Chairman, just the Uniform Commercial Code idea at this
Yeah,
time?
just the idea of using the UCC as our avenue.
Well, there's probably people in the room that are far more versed in the UCC than I am, but the question that's on my mind is, so the UCC creates uniformity with respect to rights and remedies of different types of transactions, right? There's one article of the UCC that deals with secure transactions, right? So for any bank or individual that's going to enter into a secure transaction where you're defining the collateral and what those collateral rights are and how we're going to contract around that, right? That's what the UCC provides. Or, it does that in a number of different contexts. I think what David said was correct. Defining this type of property as an intangible right is fine, but that doesn't change the enforcement, nor would we want it to under the UCC. If you individually take that property right that is your personal data and contract for it, right? Depending on the context of what that contract is doing, you might find a remedy under the UCC, but I don't think we're going to create a new remedy under the UCC, at least not the way I'm looking at it.
Mr. Coppin, if you declared that all of your personal data as defined herein is your intangible personal property, and you effectively own all of it, right now, it's all over the place, right? That personal data is all over the place. If it became your asset and were treated like intangible personal property, I think in some instances it's pretty straightforward what would happen. But again, if you applied that definition as provided in the Uniform Commercial Code so that everybody understood, all right, well, this is literally your property. What are the implications? Do you see any unintended consequence of that application of it? And this is why it's as the alternate language as opposed to the primary language, because it's not something that I think has really been thought through before. But what are your first thoughts?
Yeah, and again, I'm wading into areas that I don't have a lot of expertise on, so forgive me. But an example that's coming to mind is, I mean, hundreds of times over my 20-year legal practice, we've had clients that have been served notices under the Millennium Copyright Act, for example, right? For violating that. And the enforcement mechanism that most companies use is just sort of, we call it spray and pray, right? You just give notices to anyone and everyone, and it becomes such a burden and their statutory, deterrence for people just ignoring that they kind of have to deal with it. Well, A, it's a huge burden. B, it's an enormous, suck on the legal industry, right? Because you have, like patent trolls, now you have copyright trolls, right? That just harass companies. Why wouldn't you use this in the exact same way, right? If every single piece of data about you is suddenly going to become this property right, whether or not you know how it's being used. And I'm not arguing that it shouldn't be a property right. I'm just, with respect to the unintended consequences under this, you're now creating a private right under the Consumer Protection Act. And I just looked while David was testifying at the list of those unlawful practices as it's defined under the Consumer Protection Act. They don't really fit, they don't really fit this scenario. So in my mind, one of the biggest unintended consequences is that spray and pray, that all of a sudden we've created a really clunky square peg round hole remedy that people are going to be pursuing. And how do you meaningfully enforce it, and how do you meaningfully defend it?
So is that with regard to, that sounded at the end like it was broadening out beyond just the idea of the intangible personal property aspect, which is
I'm talking about the enforcement specifically, I
getting
think.
back to the enforcement aspect of it. So with the bill itself, even with the original 201 language, you'd have that concern.
Sorry, I'm going to try to find 201, but yes.
It's on page 2. Yeah, so you've got the two different languages. One of them, as I mentioned, on page 3, the alternative language would actually create a property right of intangible personal property of the natural person. And the UCC would apply. The 201 as in the bill on page 2 just kind of makes a legislative finding which guides the principle of the concept, but then everything else is based on language similar to the Colorado Privacy Act. Now, the key difference in how this ends up playing out by making it natural person as opposed to consumer, Colorado Privacy Act and every other privacy act in the country that has passed, and there are quite a few now as we reviewed a couple of meetings ago, apply to consumers and then have a very limited subset of companies that have to comply with it. So your largest social media providers and largest companies in the country, the billion-dollar companies, would have to comply, but smaller companies really have no obligation under other states' privacy acts to do anything about personal data. The difference here by making it a natural person is that you see with the definition on page 4 of controller that it's basically any entity using it for any purpose other than personal use. And then personal use shall not include any use of a professional or commercial nature, whether for profit or not. And the idea there is that rather than having a short list of entities that are obligated under this Privacy Act, it would basically be anybody using it for a commercial use, an organizational use, an institutional use, some organized use, as the baseline. So getting back, Mr. Coppin, to your discussion about the enforcement mechanism and how that's engaged. Other states are doing it effectively as something similar to an unfair trade practice because they're specifically in the commercial realm, where this doesn't necessarily have to be in the commercial realm, but that statute is already a reasonable vehicle. Most of what needs to be there is there. And so rather than duplicating it or amending it through this bill draft, I think there would be some edge cases where it might struggle. But most of the time, it would probably be a commercial use at which you were providing and trying to find remedy. So I don't know if that helps to clarify, but go ahead, Mr. Coppin.
I just have a follow-up question, Mr. Chairman. Are we aware of other states that have baked the UCC language at all in any way, shape, or form?
Oh, I'm sorry, that was a little ambiguous. No other state has done the UCC thing in any way. And so this bill as drafted, other than that footnote, the staff comment, doesn't use the UCC either. The rest of the bill is not relying on intangible personal property UCC. That's just an alternative concept, which honestly obviates most of the rest of the bill, because then you simply say personal data is intangible personal property and it's treated as property. So we have a lot of statutes about what happens if you take somebody's property, et cetera. Go ahead, Mr. Coffey.
Yeah, I guess where I'm struggling with that, and again, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to keep prefacing by saying I'm wading into areas that I'm not an expert in, but I mean, we don't look to the UCC to define intellectual property in and of itself, right? We don't look to the UCC to define what's patentable, what's trademarkable, right? What's copyrightable. We look to the UCC to categorize that property, again, for purposes of contractual rights and remedies in a commercial context, whether it's a lending transaction or a sales transaction or whatever. So I'm just, that's where I'm struggling a little bit. And maybe somebody can point me to examples of where that's happened. I may just not know, but identifying the property right as defined by the UCC to me seems fraught with risk.
I think, Mr. Kaufman, the intent there is to treat it as intangible personal property more generally. And you see in the language on page 3, although I can see how we might need to add a little bit of additional based on that discussion. It says, as intangible personal property, personal data is subject to the property protections provided by this article. It probably needs to be statutory protections or something along those lines if we're going to go full intangible personal property. The Wyoming Uniform Commercial Code and the United States and Wyoming Constitutions. The idea being that statutorily and legally treating your personal data as your property and then characterizing it for the purposes of UCC as intangible personal property so that it's managed in accordance with that, but also getting back to intellectual property type concepts, you would want those to effectively apply as well. The idea of your data is your property. But that, again, that complicates it. And that's why that's a big part of the reason why it's a staff comment instead of in the bill. Mr. Co-Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. So, Mr. Coffin, I just want to make sure I'm understanding your thought process correctly. It's not that the mapping it to the UCC in of itself is the problem. It's just the remedy component, as you say, kind of this square peg in a round hole type of approach to resolution and remedies. Is that a fair understanding?
Mr. Coppin, I think both were problems, as you stated. Go ahead.
Yeah, and again, I'm thinking about this from the context of our state law, because we don't have state patent laws, right? But we have state trademark laws that allow you a private right of action if someone is misappropriating your trade secret or your, you know, trademark protectable IP. And that property right isn't defined or created by the UCC in that context, even though that IP could be used as collateral, right, in a UCC style transaction, or it could be, you know, defined as general intangibles in a UCC defined or styled transaction, but that didn't create the property right. So my first issue is I think we just have to be really careful trying to rely on the UCC to create a property right. I don't even know off the top of my head what the general intangible definition is in the UCC. Probably somebody can tell us that, but we'd have to look and see under Wyoming law what that definition even is. But then secondly, I guess, Representative Western, to your other question, the remedy could be any number of things, right? I think we talked about this just a little bit at the last hearing, and we talked about the remedies under, for example, the Trade Secret Act, right? When someone misappropriates your trade secret, there's this particular burden of proof, this particular style of civil cause of action to stop someone from doing that, which is different than, right, what this contemplates under the Consumer Protection Act style enforcement, right? Which is, as I said, the Consumer Protection Act lists a whole bunch of ways that someone engages in these deceptive practices, and those deceptive practices are designed so it's intended to stop that action, but we don't rely in that context on the enforcement mechanism for the civil. So I think we need to break this into what are we wanting to do? Are we wanting to create a property right, or are we wanting to stop people from doing this? I think those questions, at least in my mind, help me understand how we go at this.
Well, and I think the answer to that is ideally both, but the property right is much more complicated than the stopping people from doing it. So again, and as this is drafted, it doesn't create the property right. It doesn't quite get to that point because of those complexities. But the intent, which is similar to what you see in other states' privacy acts, is to stop companies from taking the actions or violating, as you see on page, let's see, the rights that you see on page 8, the personal data rights, which are similar to the privacy rights in other states. And again, the language is very similar to the Colorado Privacy Act. And those opportunities, the remedy, and a big part of the remedy, we had a bill draft where all the remedy was explicit, and that was about 8 to 10 additional pages, which were very similar to what we had under the Wyoming Consumer Protection Act as remedies. So the way this is structured, rather than recodifying the Wyoming Consumer Protection Act and modifying it to be more directly and clearly appropriate for these actions, the idea on page 13, the E paragraph, is to just say that violation of this section shall be considered a consumer transaction that constitutes a deceptive trade practice under Wyoming statute, and then simply amending the definition of consumer transactions such that this is included in that. And for any circumstance where it is a consumer transaction, which is probably 99% of the time that most people would be worried about, it would seem to work well. It's just the off cases where you might have a non-consumer related transaction or where you don't have a direct commercial purpose, but you've got some organization that might be collecting information for non-commercial purposes. This act would still require compliance under that C paragraph, but at that point, you're stretching the idea that it's a consumer transaction a little bit because there isn't necessarily a commercial interest. But that said, when you read through the 7 pages that we have here about what the mechanism is for taking action and the remedies, that it honestly seems to work. As far as the stepwise process, having a private right of action, having the AG with an opportunity to enforce. So, Mr. Kaufman, I guess I'd ask, what are you seeing as problematic if the enforcement mechanism, again, assuming that now we're not going down the it becomes property path, we're just going down this is the Wyoming Privacy Act component of it, where it may not work statutorily to go with the E paragraph, which requires the Consumer Protection Act as the enforcement provision. Any examples that you can kind of think of? Because I was trying to work some of those out. I wasn't coming up with any where it seemed to just completely fall apart.
So Mr. Chairman, I'm trying to do this on the fly, which is dangerous, but
No worries.
I had pulled up while David was testifying the 4012-105, which is the full definition of those unlawful practices defined under the Consumer Protection Act. And when I scan through those, and I haven't read these, I mean, these are very tailored towards merchandise sales, warranties, bait and switch advertising. You see where I'm going with that? So I guess that's one of the first things that I was just keen in on is if we're relying on that mechanism to enforce and create whether it's a private right of action or otherwise, you're going to have to find some of those claims that somehow fit, right? The circumstance for purposes of using that act for enforcement.
But Mr. Kaufman, we add to that list a violation of that C paragraph. So you don't have to make bait and switch fit, because if you violate the C paragraph beginning on, or excuse me, the B paragraph beginning on page 8, that's on your list as an unfair trade practice. Does that make sense? So for example, the A paragraph says no controller shall process the personal data of a natural person in violation of the natural person's personal data rights set forth in B, et cetera. So I guess it's the A paragraph that kind of falls under that, where you would contemplate then that failing to allow the right to opt out, failing to allow the right of portability or deletion would effectively be added to that list as unfair trade practices.
So I'm trying to work this language out
Yep.
in my head, Mr. Chairman, because the Consumer Protection Act says in the course of the business and in connection with the consumer transaction, the person knowingly, and then we're suggesting now that the knowingly component of that cause of action would be the failure to allow them the right to opt out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I gotta give that some thought.
Okay.
I'm not trying to be a problem.
No,
here.
no, absolutely. This is the challenge. And I mean, candidly, we could, although it's just not desirable. This bill is 27 pages long, 28 as written. 7 of those pages fortunately just go away because it's a reprint of statute. So it's about a 21-page bill. The bill that we started with, I believe, was 47 pages. And that is still a far cry short of like the California Consumer Protection, which I think was 200 pages or something like that when we were looking at it. So trying to not reinvent the wheel if we don't have to. And honestly, if the remedies need to be reinvented, we can reinvent them, right? You just, instead of this E paragraph that we create where we call it an unfair trade practice or deceptive trade practice under 4012-105, so the page 13 E paragraph. Other bill drafts we've had have had language, which is similar to what's in other states, about what the remedies are and what you can do. One of the challenges there, candidly, is it's a big point of contention what the remedies are. Most of the large companies are perfectly happy to send folks in just to fight a private right of action. So it all becomes a discussion about private right of action. Our Consumer Protection Act already has a private right of action. It already has a cure. It already has all the things that are desirable, even if it's not a perfect act. They're the desirable consumer protections, which at this point in time are actually hard to win in a bill because of some of the concerns that you raised, which is that you end up with a lot of lawsuits. Larger companies are trying to avoid any opportunity or exposure to lawsuits. And so this seemed like an elegant path towards just saying, all right, we'll use our existing Consumer Protection Act and we're not going to open it up for debate.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr.
are we aware of any other states taking that approach with respect to integrating the Consumer Protection Act?
I do not believe so.
Because again, this is just where my brain's going. We're talking about creating this property right. The Consumer Protection Act doesn't, at least as far as I'm aware, really create any property right.
Well, this would be in the absence.
So I think it's sort of like IP, right? And then we have this Consumer Protection Act, which to me just is sort of a different concept. I'm wondering if there's a better way to tie that together than using the consumer protection. And maybe there's a great example and maybe I'm missing something, but.
I don't know that you're missing anything, except I think, the bill draft as drafted really doesn't create that property right necessarily. That would be an optional switch that we would have to flip and change that language to create the property right. At this point, it is more of a personal protection as opposed to a consumer protection. That, to me, seems like the only place that it fails to align appropriately is that this act is a little broader than a Consumer Protection Act. If we were to narrow it so that it only applied to commercial purposes, which is how other states do it, then it would seem to simply be a consumer protection. That's how it is in other states, even though I'm not sure that most of the other states, and I'll look to David, I believe all of the other states we looked at created remedies within the statute. They didn't refer out to their existing consumer protection. Is that accurate?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That is correct. They've got it spelled out within the statute. And of course, they've got those limitations on who it applies to, generally, being the larger social media companies.
So, Mr. Kaufman, at the same time, I think a lot of the reason for that is that whereas we're looking at a broader scope, they were looking at very narrow scopes of, writing a statute for these 7 companies kind of thing. Which again, we could potentially do, but as we've discussed before, it just creates so much room for loophole that I don't know why you've protected anybody realistically. It's just a veneer of consumer protection without actually having any merit.
And Mr. Chairman, I'm not aware, but are there any other states that we could possibly look at for a good comparison? I've heard that, for example, Connecticut has a good framework, but I'm not familiar.
Framework for what?
For this type of.
Again, the overall, so for the data privacy side, there are a number of states, and the Colorado's, which we emulated to a large degree, was kind of the most recent build, so to speak, right? They passed theirs fairly recently, and it's about as good as these bills get. Did we have any that passed since? Does anyone, Clarissa and David? I don't remember any that passed more recently.
Mr. Chairman, I do believe there were a few that have passed more recently.
That passed afterwards. Okay. But they are all complying with the same formula, where that formula is a small number of very large companies. And so it doesn't, and focused specifically on consumer protection with certain provisions that also typically a focus on having a requirement for the AG to be the agent of action, few of them, to my recollection, have a private right of action. So it's, and we'll probably hear public testimony from industry in a few minutes about how much they hate this bill for all the reasons that we're talking about, because it actually does apply to all citizens and in not just in consumer capacity with limited bells and whistles. So I don't think there's not a model that does what we're trying to do, which is why it's hard to write, honestly. Other thoughts? Any committee? Mr. Co-Chairman?
Mr. Co-Chairman, I mean, I think it's really interesting discussion. I think Mr. Kaufman makes some really interesting points. I agree that we have to be really careful if we are creating this right, but as I read the bill, you know, if we map it to the UCC, we're not inherently creating that right. We're just simply saying, in these circumstances, this is how this is handled, whether it's, you know, a remedy around commerce or some sort of contractual obligation, which is what the UCC is for. I mean, at the end of the day, just given the inherent nature of data and data sharing and data usage, there's always going to be that pecuniary component to these types of engagements, right? Obviously, at the early days of these social media companies, they said, hey, use their platform for free. By the way, we're going to monetize all your data, and there's nothing you can do because you signed the terms and conditions. You check the box. So I think we can't, whatever we come up with, we can't ignore the fact that there's going to be that commercial, financial component to any of these types of engagements between a consumer and these tech companies. So again, absent any other better idea, without going down the prickly road of really defining that property right, but certainly saying whatever that right is, we're going to use what we've already got in the books that we know works pretty darn well to govern the relationships between these parties over this personal data.
Right.
I obviously, you know, Mr. Kaufman's a skilled litigator, so I won't deny that the remedy component can be a little clunky and cumbersome, and you know, obviously that's an area where some massaging ought to be done on the language and the options and what we want to try to put in the green books. But at a conceptual level, I'm as bullish as ever on the UCC component, just given the inherent financial nature of the data and it's how it's not going anywhere.
And Mr. Co-Chairman, one other consideration, you know, we've struggled with this bill for several years because of these questions and how challenging it is to get this perfect, while also looking around the country and not seeing anyone having gotten it perfect or anything resembling perfect. Part of the challenge that we've had in the past is that the bills that we were drafting were too much like other states and not enough like what we've been working on, so that they would comport well with the digital identity work we're doing and moving towards. The hope with this bill is that while it's certainly not going to be perfect, and this does seem like one where it needs some iteration over a few years, probably, to try and get things right and to have experiences that we can then react to and try to fix it. The hope with this bill draft as it is at this point is that it is amendable appropriately in the future or currently as we work through it, so that it keeps moving towards that objective of a comprehensive digital identity structure that appropriately recognizes data rights and privacy. And all of that is coherent, even if it's not immediately realized. For example, you see that the name, image, likeness discussion, which is targeted towards advertising in this legislation, is not perfectly integrated by any means with the data privacy, because we're looking at two different models. The ideal would be to seamlessly intertwine those two and make them work together. But that's a challenge. So my hope is that we can have a draft that passes that makes things better than they are now, but not perfect, and then continue to iterate, make them better and better. So the biggest concern I see is, you know, are we can we identify areas through this bill draft where if we implemented it, the unintended consequences would be honestly bad, right? So very negative consequences that we would want, that would hold us back from supporting it. All the while recognizing that it's not going to be perfect by any stretch of the imagination and that it will need more work. But we need to start moving in a functional direction, get something passed, and recognize that since no other state has actually solved this problem, we might not get it perfect the first time. Mr. Coffin.
Mr. Chairman, I hear that. And again, I am not trying to be a problem.
Yeah, no,
but I
I
just
appreciate that
can't
point.
help but wonder if that approach could cut against us really badly in this context if we don't get it right because of the unintended consequences for a lot of sectors, right? I don't think on this topic we can necessarily afford to be really wrong in our first attempt, you know? So that just bothers me a
Mhm.
little bit. Well, it bothers me a lot. But I understand what you're saying, that there is importance to try to get our arms around defining this. And I'm
Yeah.
all for that. That's where my brain keeps going is, you know, maybe I'm preconditioned because of how we approach the digital asset stuff. But one of the first things we did was we defined that right. We defined that, find the property right.
Mm-hmm.
And that was incredibly useful, right? And I think that's something that's wrong right now is we're trying to mix and match from different statutory, you know, components. What is the property right? What is the right that this person has? What's the hammer, you know, to go use that in enforcing some private right of action? And now what are all the definitions that go along with that? And we're borrowing it from some places that just don't quite match.
Well, I mean, that is a rational approach to go the other direction and effectively work on an appropriate 201. So again, going to page 3, the top, the alternative language of 403201. If we take the approach that we want to get personal data ownership correct, and then rely on the implications of that and other statutes and say, you own your data, it's your property, and then start building on what that means. That's very consistent, I think, with what we've done in the past and the intent. It doesn't, and that might take a few years to build out what that means. So honestly, it could start with a much shorter bill that says you own your data, and then we build out. And Mr. Hopkinson and I even talked about this. Make that a 3-page bill-ish, where you try and define it really well and what that means, and then rely on other statutes to a large degree in the beginning for property rights and ownership. That's massive deviation from other states, but Mr. Co-Chairman, as you were saying a few minutes ago, that is probably the right long-term objective. That's the desired outcome. And part of the reason, though, part of the reason for this bill draft being the way it is the desire to take advantage of or provide some privacy protections for our citizens where they don't have those right now, because we haven't gotten this bill across the finish line because of all the other problems that it's had. So we don't see Wyoming citizens participating in some of the benefits of protections where you have websites and commercial enterprise that are willing to limit their scope and provide rights to citizens that have them, while at the same time denying those to those that don't. Mr. Coffin, would you be more interested then in this alternative of trying to get personal data ownership correct and not worrying about the rest of it?
Mr. Chairman, I feel self-conscious that I'm dominating the conversation here. I mean, I think so. That feels like a better approach to me. And we kind of have danced around that in prior hearings, right? I mean,
Yeah.
we've
Oh, yeah. We talked about it for years.
we've attempted that. So I feel like we're not starting from scratch on that. But to me, that makes a lot more sense at a foundational level. Let's get that
Mhm.
right first.
Sounds cool to me. Other thoughts? Let's draw some others into the committee. Yeah, Mr. Representative Singh.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question about the bill as to whether or not this would apply to any media that was produced before the date that we have set in 2025. So would this apply retroactively to content that, someone had their picture taken or video taken like years ago, but then it was released after this date? Would this be protected?
Mr. Hopkinson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So potentially, really one of the things the bill is in some senses, I don't know that I want to use narrowly tailored, but it's just giving a natural person that list of rights that we see in 203. So they would be able, if someone has their personal data, to reach out to them and ask them to do one of those things. And so potentially it could apply in a scenario where we're talking about data that was obtained years ago. And that has its own implications, certainly. Are we dealing with potentially impairment of contracts, those sorts of things, and those could be separate issues that could be dealt with, on their own merits, and could potentially impact these rights, but the bill doesn't go quite that far.
Representative, any follow-up?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Those are just some of the concerns that I have with the bill as it's written right now. I'm also interested in how it would interact with one-party consent when it comes to the release of recordings and personal matters. And so that's just what I'm thinking about.
Thank you, Representative. Anyone else have any discussion? We're going to go to public comment shortly, so we'll still have plenty of opportunities. But before we go to that, I think this was a great discussion. All right. With that, let's go to public comment. I think we've got a few. Let's start in the room. Does anyone want to provide public comment at this time in the room? We have some online. All right, let's go online. Is Ms. Kaiser available? All right, let's bring in Ms. Kaiser. Well,
Good day,
hello, Ms.
everyone.
Kaiser. Great to see you.
Good to see you again. Thank you, Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Brittany Kaiser. I'm the founder and president of the Own Your Data Foundation, a Wyoming 501c3 that advocates for personal data ownership and digital literacy. Firstly, thank you for bringing this bill to the floor today. For me, over the past 7 years, I have been one of the world's largest advocates on ascribing property rights to data to give it proper legal recourse for individuals, especially in the case of data breaches, as opposed to relying on human rights law or privacy law, where fines for civil violations are usually baked into the cost of doing business for large companies and don't really offer true protections to individual rights. For me, there's a lot of reasons for the committee to move forward with a version of this bill, even a pared down version, which I thought was actually quite a good way to perhaps move forward on this, where it can be built upon, given that personal data ownership as a legal concept is still quite young. I really believe that this started in Wyoming when we passed in March 2018 a bill that said your digital assets are your intangible personal property. Originally, for a few years after that, I hoped we would actually just add personal data as a type of digital asset, where it would already be a part of a bill that has been passed and active for a while, but it made sense due to the Privacy Act and a lot of other considerations for it to perhaps become its own bill. We've also talked over the years in various subcommittees of this committee about different ways to implement this. And so we have discussed, personal data trusts, where there could be third parties where once individuals claim ownership of data, that could be managed either by themselves or by a third party, with permission structures, hygiening, matching, modeling, and monetization off of the back of that in a personal data trust structure in Wyoming. We've gone back and forth on different ways that this could be enforceable and ways where Wyoming could open the doors for new technology companies to come to Wyoming and set up under this new legal framework. But what I really believe is that in general, personal data ownership is finally becoming a trend, and we're starting to see it. New major laws passed, every few months in different parts of the world. After 2018, when we passed the digital assets are your intangible personal property in Wyoming, it was not long after that that I became the first expert witness in the first successful case against Equifax. In the state of Minnesota, we sued Equifax for property damage, and we won at the Supreme Court. So in the state of Minnesota, you own your data as your property, and you have the right to compensation for property damage under a data rights framework in terms of case law. We now are starting to see more and more jurisdictions introduce bills that have some component of personal data rights that include data ownership. Even in CPRA, which doesn't really ascribe data ownership, it does give you the right to ask a company if they are monetizing your data, and if so, how much. So that is one piece of the puzzle, but it doesn't really give you a framework for taking action past that. There are now probably hundreds of companies around the world that are trying to solve this, especially with the growth of AI, where the ownership and definition of the ownership of all data sets that are going into global AI training is going to be the most important foundational piece of how reliable AI are. If that AI company has the ability to be sued by tons of companies where their data has been improperly used for training these data sets and algorithms, as well as the ability to monetize your own data to become an input into consensual, hygiened data that is going into more reliable and ethical AI platforms. So there's a huge opportunity for this. Actually in November in Brazil, they're going to be considering the first bill for personal data ownership, which does have majority support at the moment, as well as in the UAE. So it's becoming more prevalent around the world. And I really believe that since Wyoming was the first place in the world to really pass something that ascribed some kind of rights that could be defined as personal data ownership, that pushing forward on this and giving more definitions and more tools for an individual to use to protect their rights is incredibly important. And so I would love to see this go forward in some sort of way. I am an advocate for perhaps paring it down and starting more simple with defining the right, and then going forward on all of the different methods of personal or public action. That is what I would really love to see. And for me, I have worked on both sides. I work in tech and I work in protection of individual rights as a former human rights lawyer and former whistleblower against Cambridge Analytica and Facebook. So I know both sides of this, of how important it is for companies to be able to monetize data and how important it is to be able to protect your individual data or monetize it for your own benefit should you wish to. So I really think beginning with defining the right is the best way to bridge those gaps. So companies understand that they can have access to consensual data that people are sharing willingly with specific permission structures and the ability to own part of that monetization. And on the other side, it allows individuals to engage in a more ethical digital life than they do today, where right now we're giving away all of the data for free with no rights to see where it's going, how it's being used, and with very, very loose legal protections that are nearly impossible to define in court. So since property rights is the strongest legal framework in the world and is especially strong in the state of Wyoming, I do believe that giving individuals these rights over their personal data is the best step forward. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thanks, Ms. Kaiser. Any questions for Ms. Kaiser? Any questions? Ms. Kaiser, you mentioned that Brazil had some legislation and UAE had some legislation along these lines. Any other, we can get that legislation and take a look at it. Anywhere else that you would point us to in terms of bill drafts in the space, things that you consider to be best practices in terms of defining this right? that we should be aware of?
Yeah, I really believe that everything that I've just mentioned here, from Wyoming already having law that digital assets are intangible personal property, where of course we meant digital assets perhaps as blockchain tokens, in that it's all still ones and zeros that are owned by an individual. So whether it's personal data or whether it's, blockchain based tokenized data, it's all really talking about the same thing. So I believe that's really the basis. CPRA giving your right to ask if companies are monetizing your data and by how much, so that you may be able to claim some of that, I think is quite important. The Supreme Court case law of McCarthy v. Equifax, I think is very important to look at, and where the CEO of Equifax admitted in federal US Congress that he would feel that his property had been damaged if his data was released. I can also share with you after this session some of the working drafts of the legislation going on in Brazil and the UAE, and some of the other considerations that have been in deliberation around the world but haven't resulted in a bill just yet.
Thank you. One of the discussion points that we had, I think a few years ago, you were involved in that discussion on this topic, was around the idea of trying to ensure that by making it a property right, you actually don't end up diminishing the standing of the privacy rights, other constitutional rights, and that you don't commoditize it in a way that is detrimental to the individual, but you're actually trying to build up the rights of that individual. I think you were part of that discussion a few years ago. And any further thoughts on how we can do that? Do we see a model for best practices there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is one of the most important ethical considerations of this conversation. Of course, you'll get a lot of big tech lobbyists that are going to say, people with the lowest purchasing power are going to be the ones that are going to monetize their data, which might make them more vulnerable. But the truth is, right now, everybody's data is being monetized. We just don't have any rights, claims, or monetization rights on any of it. So they're just trying to get us to not claim the value of our data. I do think in order to make this easier for industry, probably not having retroactivity is going to be the easiest way to pass something where we have some rights to a percentage of the monetization of our data. And likely the technical solutions that are going to be implemented is that each individual will have a digital identity and a data wallet where we will all verify the data that is held across different companies and industries about us. We can update hygiene or say, hey, this is too private, I would not like to share. Define all of our permission structures ourselves, because it should be our right to choose how we would like our data to be used or not. And then that data can be consented to be used by companies around the world. With the growth of AI, this is a very easy income stream for anybody around the world. It might not buy you a new house, but it will certainly be able to buy your groceries. And I think everyone should have that right.
Anything about one other point along those lines? We had some discussion about the inalienability of some aspects of personal data and ensuring reversibility of transactions or something along those lines. Is that present in Brazil or UAE? Basically, the idea that I can't sell my lifetime personal data rights for $1 and then never get those back because I've engaged in a contract for all my personal data, something along those lines, extreme circumstance. How do Brazil and UAE contemplate those types of scenarios in the way that they roll out the right?
Both of the pieces of current legislation contemplate it as an ongoing personal right, where you can decide on data point to data point or a certain set of data points that different companies are holding, what you would like to share or not. There is currently no contemplation for selling lifetime data rights like you can sell life rights in the film or literary industry. But I think that's something that definitely should be brought up, because I'm also a huge advocate of people not selling their full life rights and only doing limited life rights for a period of time.
Okay, excellent. All right, any further questions for Ms. Kaiser? All right, seeing none, thank you. It's very good to see you. I hope you're doing well, and we appreciate your testimony and involvement as always.
Thank you. You too. Thank you, everybody.
All right, where's my post-it note? There we go. All right, I believe we have Miss Ruthie Barco online. Let's bring in Miss Barco. Miss Barco, welcome. Please state your name and association for the record, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Ruthie Barco. I represent TechNet. It is wonderful to join the committee again today. TechNet is the nationwide network. We represent over 89 tech companies around the world, and we appreciate being able to share our thoughts on this bill with the committee. We understand that the intent is to create a property right that protects the name, image, and likeness of individuals, as well as to address the protection of personal data. However, we are concerned that this appears to create an incomplete data privacy law, and we would encourage the Select Committee to consider instead a bill with draft language for a comprehensive data privacy law that would be interoperable with the laws already in existence. We would prefer to have a federal data privacy law in place that would be easier for compliance for every company in the United States that has to comply with these. But in the absence of that federal standard, it is absolutely critical that states do not enact data privacy laws that create different operational frameworks between states, which can ultimately put some states at a disadvantage and create a landscape of conflicting laws that are difficult for businesses to comply with. To answer your question, Mr. Chairman, from the committee discussion on the bill, I believe that the count now would be that actually 17 state data privacy laws have passed since the passage of the Colorado Privacy Act. So the current national total is 20 bills. That means almost half of the United States has passed a data privacy law. And that's why we're encouraging, if you are looking at data privacy protections for personal data, that you do comply with what's already there. It might be better to bifurcate the issues in this bill. And I appreciated the discussion earlier about enforceability and how the broad applicability of this law would make that a little bit difficult. No other state has created a property right in personal data because those implications are broad, and we don't know that that would make sense given this landscape of data privacy laws across the United States to add that in. Instead, we encourage a focus on the consumer data rights in all other states right now that have passed a bill. Those are the rights to the consumer rights to access data, to correct your data, to delete your data, and the portability of your data. Those are all very critical. These rights are both more concrete and prevalent in every state that has adopted a comprehensive privacy law to date. We are concerned that this draft bill conflicts with those laws in several key ways. So we appreciate you looking to the Colorado Privacy Act. I think the most recent one last year was Nebraska, and then New Hampshire passed one as well. Many of the terms include a new idea, which is undefined, of personal digital identity that is not used in other laws, and the draft bill is missing other defined terms that are standard practice now in data privacy law. Again, because nearly half the states have passed these, we do think standardized legal definitions are critical to interoperability, and they do apply to a great number of companies. It isn't just the largest corporations that have to comply with these. Actually, with the implementation of the Colorado Privacy Act, it was affecting smaller nonprofits, journalistic organizations, local newspapers, because the threshold in Colorado was the processing of 100,000 individuals' data in a calendar year, or over 25,000 individuals if it was the sale of personal data. So the threshold does actually loop in many more companies than I think the committee was discussing. It does not include many of the exclusions in scope, nor the limitations of application for beneficial uses of data that are in other data privacy laws. Data practices that are covered by federal statutes such as HIPAA, the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, COPPA, the Federal Credit Reporting Act, and Graham-Leach-Bliley would also be covered by this state law. And business data practices consumers have come to expect, such as fighting and detecting fraud or providing services they've already requested, would all of a sudden not be allowed or be difficult to provide in Wyoming because of these compliance issues. I did appreciate that And the staff acknowledged that even with allowing for the preemption of by other laws in the language in this bill, it would still be difficult to ascertain how broadly this would apply in practice, which is why those other state laws have those exemptions and those exceptions specifically listed out. We agree with that assessment by staff. This bill does not address key provisions that clarify when an entity is acting as a controller of data or when they are a processor of data working on a controller's behalf. Other states have clear rights and duties for each party. This bill creates a private right of action in 3 places through references to unlawful deceptive trade practices law, as the committee was discussing. This doesn't conflict with the enforcement regime in all other state data privacy laws because minor and correctable violations or of timeframes or failure to include a specific piece of data could be prevalent. Other state data privacy laws are subject to attorney general enforcements, including rights to cure. Also contrary to this draft bill, nearly all states have avoided rulemaking authority for state agencies, in part because it has added complexity, uncertainty, and cost of compliance to state businesses. The Colorado Privacy Act rulemaking took, I think, about 18 months to process. This is not the intent, of course, with rulemaking, but the clear consequence in states that undertake those efforts. And when New Hampshire passed their bill, they had to amend it this year to remove the rulemaking at the request of their state entities. And finally, more than a year of an effective date is needed for Wyoming businesses, especially those smaller businesses that do not operate across many state lines, in order to get ready for an extensive new law of this nature. Our aim is to support interoperability with the prevalent privacy laws to ensure Wyoming and national businesses provide robust privacy protections to citizens while avoiding outlier provisions that would be unique only to Wyoming. Such provisions rarely offer substantial privacy improvements, but they do create significant unnecessary compliance costs for businesses, large and small. Therefore, we strongly recommend working from existing state laws. And with respect to the section on digital likeness, it is quite broad, and we wish to better understand the select committee's intent with that provision as it applies to any use of a likeness without prior consent, rather than focusing on synthetic manipulation or generated media as is typically addressed by states. Also, while the bill includes some exemptions for the use of someone's likeness incidentally in an image, the bill does not specify what sort of injury or harm would qualify as an instance in which an individual could file a suit. We think greater clarity would be helpful in this bill language to avoid frivolous litigation. And again, we look forward to working with the committee on this bill. We appreciate your consideration of our amendment suggestions, and we hope that you will reach out if we can be of further assistance before the final meeting in November. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions for Ms. Barco? Any questions for Ms. Barco? Ms. Barco, I do have a question, and it's part question, part concern, but we've been working on this for a few years. And one of the things that I think we've stressed in these conversations with you and others is that the privacy acts that are being passed in the other states really aren't very robust. They are long and detailed and have a lot of language, but at the end of the day, they don't necessarily provide tremendous protection for the people. And in fact, they seem rather to provide relatively strong protections for industry. And I guess my concern is I understand the desire by industry to have compliance by all the states to fall in line and get behind a common piece of legislation that's passed in all the states, because that's very easy for industry. But I guess my question is, if that's going to be the strategy, would it not be advantageous to have a bill draft that actually protected the citizens of the states more broadly, as we're aspiring to do, instead of simply really protecting the interests of the large industries that I know are co-sponsors of TechNet? What are your thoughts on that?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I would say that the privacy acts that are already in place are not only applying to large corporations. As I mentioned, there were local nonprofits in Colorado that were reaching out to the Attorney General during the rulemaking because they were concerned about the fact that they would have to comply with this law and they don't have robust legal departments to help them do so. But, they they're not large corporations, but they fell under the purview of these bills. So I think that there's a little bit, there is absolutely a larger penumbra on these bills than I think is being discussed. It is absolutely not only large corporations. As far as providing more robust protections, we would be happy to have a conversation about what those are. We actually think that there should be more detail in this draft bill about that relationship between controllers and processors. And those are great more about data protection assessments that have to be done, a lot more about the contractual relationships between controllers and processors that is not in this draft bill. So we think there are additional protections that could be added. But I think that with any legislation dealing with technology, you should never look at it as just the finite end of the spectrum with where that law is going to go. Case in point with Colorado, they're actually creating a new rulemaking starting this fall because they actually built upon the Colorado Privacy Act to add biometric laws on top of it. So I think that from our perspective, we think that because so many states have passed these laws, make sure that anything other states are looking at is interoperable, and then they can always be built upon. And I think that's, true whether you're talking about data privacy or legislation dealing with artificial intelligence. We think an incremental approach is helpful. And we think from here, just starting from the interoperable foundation that has developed is the most prudent approach.
Thank you, Ms. Spargo. But at the same time, when we look at the motivations, I understand why those would be the motivations of TechNet, because TechNet's obligation is to represent the interests of the shareholders of the companies that are effectively profiting off of the personal data that we're discussing at this point in time. So it would make good sense, and it's appropriate for you and your colleagues to advocate for laws that really don't end up protecting the consumers, the data privacy, the personal data ownership, the assurance that this data cannot be disseminated without permission, that individuals don't have a private right of action, right? Those are all things that are very good for industry and for the members of TechNet. I guess I'm struggling, honestly, and I'll just note, I'm struggling to understand why all of the states are going along with that. Because it seems to me that the obligation that we have is to actually protect the citizens' interests, and you all do a great job, candidly, of protecting industry interests. What am I missing in terms of this really being a, we're all on the same team type approach, when I just don't know how we're all on the same team?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I respectfully disagree. We absolutely think that consumers should enjoy rights to their data, and the laws that have passed do require individuals to be notified on how their data is being used, how it's being disseminated. It prohibits it prohibits, sale without disclosure. I mean, there's a great deal of protections in these laws that I think need to be acknowledged, especially just we see it with every website that you access because these laws have been passed. That's why every website you go to now has these consent disclosures about your data. The reason why that's so pervasive is because this is emerging as a data privacy framework that is protecting consumer data rights across the country.
Okay, any further questions for Ms. Sparko? All right, seeing none. Thank you, Ms. Sparko. Good to see you again.
Thank you.
All right. I believe we have Mr. Schwartz online. Let's bring Mr. Schwartz in. Mr. Schwartz, welcome. Please identify yourself for the committee, who you're with, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Chair, members of the committee, thank you for allowing me to testify today. And thanks for all your attention to this critical issue of data privacy. My name is Matt Schwartz, and I'm a policy analyst with Consumer Reports based in Washington, D.C. Consumer Reports is an independent, nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that works with consumers to create a fair and just marketplace. CR has 6 million members spread across every state in the U.S., including Wyoming. To give some background, CR has been heavily involved in the legislative push by states around the country to introduce and pass comprehensive privacy legislation. As you may know, Congress has tried and failed to pass privacy laws for years now. And so it's fallen to the states to step up and protect their constituents. And as you also might be aware, tech companies have made the rounds across states to try and pass their favored model of privacy legislation in lieu of stronger protections desired by consumer and privacy advocates. Consumer Reports has played the role generally of trying to persuade legislators to go further than what industry suggested, which is essentially to rubber stamp the harmful privacy invading practices that they already use today. Companies are surveilling our every move online, our browsing habits, our precise geolocation, our health, information about kids, in the hopes that they can monetize our data one way or another, whether that be so that they can convince us to buy more of their products, or so that they can make a profit selling our data to somebody else who wants it. That's resulted in an erosion of our basic expectation of privacy, as well as real concrete harms, such as stalking, unfair insurance pricing, denial of important life opportunities like housing, healthcare, loans, or job opportunities, all based off of information that we didn't even know we were sharing in the first place. So we're glad to see that Wyoming is taking steps towards giving consumers more control over how their information is being collected and used. We do think this bill has a fair bit to go before it protects consumers' privacy as well as it could. And I'll share 3 main thoughts for now and follow up with additional detailed comments. So first, you should consider putting limitations on what information companies can collect and share in the first place. In our view, companies should only collect and use information that's necessary to provide the service that I'm asking for. So a flashlight app on my phone shouldn't be asking me to collect my precise geolocation information. They don't need that to run their app, and it shouldn't be the consumer's responsibility to opt out of every possible extraneous use of their data that's being asked of them. So CR and other privacy groups are working on draft legislation that would get us closer to accomplishing that goal, and we'd be happy to share it with the committee if that's of interest. Second, there should be some sort of non-retaliation language in this bill to ensure that companies can't punish consumers for using their rights provided by the act. So a right is really only a right if the company is required to honor it. And if a company can respond to my opt-out request, for example, by saying that I'm no longer welcome to use their service, then that doesn't do me very much good. Luckily, there is actually standard language that's included in other state privacy laws that accomplishes that goal, and I'm happy to point it out to you if you're interested. And then third, the bill should include a universal opt-out option. Consumers don't have the time to individually read the privacy policy and fill out opt-out forms for every website that they visit. Other state laws have addressed this, especially the stronger ones, by allowing consumers to set a preference not to have their information sold or shared for targeted advertising, and then requiring every business to honor that as if the consumer had contacted them individually. So that will ensure that consumers actually have a practical way to use their privacy rights that this bill would otherwise grant them, and that businesses can't kind of game the opt-out to make it harder for consumers to use. And then last, because it's been a subject of conversation here, data as a property right. That's not generally a framing that CR has supported, just because it seems to cede to the reality that companies are going to collect and use our data anyways, and so we might as well get a few bucks out of it. I don't think that we should, give in to that reality, and should instead, as I said, focus on putting real kind of default protections on how businesses can collect and use our data, so that there's less of a need for us to get something out of it in the first place. I do think that we've made some strong steps in other state laws, like the recently passed Maryland Privacy Act, which is arguably the strongest law in the country. So I don't necessarily think it's the case that standard privacy bills are inherently incapable of protecting individuals to kind of a satisfactory level. I think it's just the case that industry has had way too much influence on many of the state laws to date. So I'll wrap it up there for now. as I mentioned, there's some other tweaks we'd like to see the legislation make, but in the meantime, I'd just like to offer myself up as a resource, and thanks to the committee again for allowing me to testify.
Thank you, Mr. Schwartz. Any questions for Mr. Schwartz? And Mr. Schwartz, I appreciate your perspective and recognizing what I think we are concerned with, which is that the industry-sponsored legislation that is going from state to state seems to be designed to protect industry, and those. It's good to hear that Maryland has put something together. I guess I'd be interested in maybe in a follow-up conversation, understanding a little bit more about what they did that was different and how they strengthened it. I would say, though, just the idea of personal data as a property right, I guess you have to see things from the perspective of Wyoming. That's not meaning to give it up and monetize it. That's stay the hell off our land kind of a property right. It tends to be the perspective that we often see. So I think that is trying to get to a level of protection that is more similar to what you're talking about, where the individual controls their data. It's theirs. It's not industries. It's literally theirs, and that they have the say in the matter. So that might be something for Consumer Reports really to give some more thought to, and perhaps we can have a follow-up conversation and talk through how that might materialize if we end up proceeding in that direction. But really appreciate your work, because I know that you're advocating on behalf of that individual. So we'll follow up, honestly, I think, to learn a little bit more about what you see as best practices.
Yeah, sounds good. Thank
Committee?
you.
Absolutely. Committee, anything else at this time? All right. Thank you, Mr. Schwartz. Appreciate it. And one more, I believe we have Ms. Agan online. Ms. Agan, state your name, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chairman. Can you hear me all right?
We can.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So my name is Carrie Agan. I'm a resident of Buffalo. I'm a retired geologist, and I have 2 degrees in the engineering and the geosciences from the Colorado School of Mines. I have 3 very short comments. One is that the state of Wyoming is not creating a right. We already have a right to privacy, and that is protected under the U.S. Constitution, the 4th Amendment, and some others. So I think that should be helpful, maybe with some of your language, if you refer to that the right is already there and that you are just protecting it. Number 2, opt-out should be the default. And I think that would help with number 1, that would be an acknowledgement that we do have privacy already. And so an opt-out being the default, that we have to opt in specifically, I think would cover that as well. Number 3, and finally, not only should selling data be covered, but also leasing, renting, bartering, transferring, all the various permutations, I think need to be covered as well. Thank you very much, Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Agan. Appreciate your input. Any questions for Ms. Agan at this time? All right, seeing none. Thank you, Ms. Agan. But I will note one thing that we struggle with. 4th Amendment's a strong protection from government privacy intrusion, but is at best a very weak protection from any commercial, corporate, or other individual. There are some extensions of the 4th Amendment that start getting outside of government, but it really does require some steadfast provisions from the state legislature to protect your privacy as it relates to other individuals and as it relates to other corporate interests. So, that adds to the importance of those second and third points that you raised. We appreciate that.
Thank you very much.
Yep. Thank you. All right. Any other public comment at this time? Seeing none, let's go back to the room real quick. Is there any final public comment in the room on these ideas? All right. Seeing none, public comment is closed. Mr. Co-Chairman, it is 12:01. This sounds like a great time for lunch.
Mr. Co-Chairman, my stomach agrees.
All right. And with that, we are on a break until 1:30, when we'll resume discussion of 25 LSO 89 working draft 0.5. See you all at 1:30.